Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The ad on Craigslist seemed perfect for someone drowning in student loans like me. $400 a month for a room in a house near campus, utilities included, with 3 other roommates to split the common areas. I'd just turned 23 that April, and after burning through most of my savings on textbooks and ramen, this place felt like a miracle. The landlord, Walter Garrison, met me at the front door on move-in day with a clipboard and a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked me through the house, pointing out the thermostat I shouldn't touch, the dishwasher that only worked on the light cycle, and the basement door at the end of the hallway. "Storage down there," he said, jangling his keys. "Each tenant gets a section, but that back room stays locked. Just old tools and equipment from when my father owned the place." I didn't think much about it those first few weeks. Between my nursing program clinicals and my part-time job at the campus bookstore, I barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about locked doors and basements. My roommates were decent enough people who kept to themselves. There was Bradley, an engineering student who lived on energy drinks and barely left his room. Natalie, who worked nights at a call center and slept during the day. And Jerome, who was finishing his MBA and spent most weekends at his girlfriend's place. We crossed paths in the kitchen occasionally, nodded politely, and went about our lives. The house had that weird quality old rentals have, where every floorboard announces your presence, and the walls seem too thin for privacy, but somehow you still feel alone. My room sat directly above the basement, second door on the right from the stairs, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence and let in exactly 45 minutes of sunlight each afternoon. The coughing started on a Monday night in early October. I remember because I'd just submitted a huge pharmacology paper and was finally allowing myself 8 hours of sleep for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, this dry, rasping sound pulled me from a dream about missing an exam. At first, I thought it was Bradley down the hall, maybe catching a cold from all those late nights. But as I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound, I realized it was coming from below. Not just below, but directly beneath my bed. The cough had a muffled quality to it, like someone trying to suppress the noise by covering their mouth with fabric or their arm. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, these horrible wheezing bursts that made my chest hurt just listening to them, and then nothing. Complete silence except for the house settling and Natalie's alarm clock going off down the hall for her 3 a.m. shift. The next morning, I caught Walter in the driveway as he was leaving after fixing the garage door. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual while holding my coffee mug like a shield between us. "Is there any way someone could be in the basement at night? I heard some weird noises." He barely glanced up from his phone, already walking toward his truck, a beat-up Ford with a cracked windshield and bumper stickers from 3 different political campaigns. "Probably the water heater," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Thing's older than you are, makes all kinds of racket when it kicks on. Had it checked last month, completely safe, just noisy." He pulled out before I could mention that water heaters don't usually cough, and I stood there in my pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt, feeling stupid for even asking. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or that sound travels weird in old houses, or that Bradley really did have a cold, and the acoustics just made it seem like it came from below. But that Friday, around midnight, the coughing returned. This time it went on for almost 5 minutes, these wet, desperate sounds that made me think of my grandfather in his last days at the hospice where I'd done my first clinical rotation. I grabbed my phone and recorded it, pressing the device against the floor to catch every wheeze and gasp. When I played it back with headphones, I could hear something else between the coughs, a rustling, like papers or plastic bags being moved around, and what might have been the squeak of old mattress springs. I sent the recording to Jerome since he was the only roommate I'd really talked to, and he responded immediately, even though it was past midnight. "That's definitely not the water heater. We should check it out." Jerome met me in the hallway 5 minutes later, holding a flashlight he'd grabbed from his car and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. We crept down to the basement like teenagers sneaking out after curfew, testing each step to avoid the creaky spots. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a rental house built in the 70s. Concrete floors, exposed beams, that particular smell of damp cardboard and forgotten things. Our storage sections were clearly marked with masking tape and Sharpie, each tenant's name in Walter's blocky handwriting. Behind a wall of stacked boxes and an old refrigerator that hummed constantly, we could see the locked door. A padlock the size of my fist secured a metal latch that had been added recently, judging by the fresh scratch marks on the worn wood. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the gap beneath the door, and we both saw it at the same time. A thin strip of light, barely visible, like someone inside had a phone charging or a nightlight plugged in. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at that sliver of light. Then, as if responding to our presence, the light shifted. A shadow passed across it, the unmistakable shape of feet moving on the other side. Jerome grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we both scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a tower of Christmas decoration boxes. Neither of us said anything until we were back upstairs in the kitchen, where Jerome poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands and downed it in one go. "We're calling the cops," he said, already pulling out his phone. But I stopped him, some ridiculous part of my brain still thinking about lease agreements and security deposits and having to find a new place in the middle of the semester. "Let me try Walter one more time," I said. "If he doesn't give me a real answer, then we call." Jerome looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he put his phone down and waited while I sent Walter a text with the video attached, telling him we knew someone was in the locked room and we needed answers now. Walter showed up 20 minutes later, which should have been my first red flag since he lived 40 minutes away. He was wearing sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, his hair sticking up like he just rolled out of bed, but his eyes were wide awake and darting between Jerome and me like he was calculating something. "You kids are being paranoid," he said. But his voice had this thin quality to it, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "That room's been locked for years. Nobody could possibly be in there." I pulled up the video on my phone, turned the volume all the way up and played the coughing sounds. His face went through this series of expressions, from dismissive to concerned to something I couldn't quite read. "Fine," he finally said, pulling out his keys with dramatic reluctance. "I'll show you there's nothing in there but rusty tools and spider webs, and then I don't want to hear about this again." He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and turned back to us. "Actually, wait here. Insurance liability and all that. I'll go check and come right back." Jerome and I looked at each other and simultaneously decided we weren't letting him go alone. We followed him down, our footsteps echoing his on the wooden stairs. Walter kept muttering under his breath, something about ungrateful tenants and market-rate rentals, but his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the padlock. The key stuck, and he had to jiggle it 3 times before the lock finally clicked open. He pushed the door inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or waste, but that concentrated human smell of unwashed clothes and stale breath and something medicinal, like cough syrup or benzocaine lozenges. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a camping cot pushed against one wall, a battery-powered lantern on an overturned milk crate, and grocery bags lined up along another wall. Empty soup cans were stacked in a corner next to a pile of pill bottles. But the worst part was the ceiling. Someone had drilled tiny holes in precise spots, each one positioned perfectly to look up into the rooms above, into our bedrooms, into our lives. "Oh God," Walter said, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. "Gordon, what have you done?" That's when we heard the toilet flush from the small bathroom. I hadn't even noticed in the corner, just a toilet and sink behind a curtain made from a shower liner. A man emerged, probably in his 50s, wearing a dingy white undershirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had Walter's same narrow face but none of his nervous energy, just this hollow resignation like he'd been caught doing something inevitable. "I told you they'd find out," Gordon said to Walter, not even looking at Jerome and me. "Told you the girl's room was too close. She was bound to hear me." He sat down on the cot with a wheeze that turned into another coughing fit, this one lasting almost a minute while Walter stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When Gordon finally stopped coughing, he looked directly at me for the first time, and his eyes had this horrible apologetic quality that made my skin prickle. "You take morning showers at 6:15, he said quietly. "Sometimes you sing that song about the astronaut. Pretty voice." Jerome already had his phone out, calling 911 while backing toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't process that this man, Gordon, had been living beneath me for months, watching through those horrible little holes, knowing my schedule better than I did. Walter started babbling, trying to explain that Gordon was his brother, that he'd lost his job and then his apartment, that it was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. "He's sick," Walter kept saying, as if that explained everything. "He's got respiratory problems, can't afford doctors. I couldn't just leave him on the street." But Gordon wasn't listening to his brother's excuses. He was looking at the holes in the ceiling with this weird pride, running his fingers along the wood. "Had to be real careful with the placement," he said to no one in particular. "Quarter-inch bit, just enough to see through but not enough for anyone to notice from above. The one over your desk is my favorite. You study so hard, writing all those notes about medications and patient care. Sometimes I pretend you're taking care of me." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 3 cars with lights but no sirens. They took Gordon away first, and he went without resistance, just asked Walter to grab his medications from the milk crate. The officers photographed everything, measured the holes, bagged the empty food containers and pill bottles. One of them, a woman with sergeant stripes, told us we'd all need to give statements, and that the house would be off limits for at least 48 hours while they processed the scene. Walter they arrested too, for criminal facilitation and endangerment. As they led him to the squad car, he kept trying to catch my eye, maybe wanting forgiveness or understanding, but I stared at the ground until the car door slammed shut. Jerome and I sat on the front steps until our other roommates got home. Then we all went to Bradley's girlfriend's apartment, cramming into her living room with sleeping bags and the weird energy of survivors from the same disaster. None of us ever went back to that house except to get our belongings with a police escort. I found a studio apartment the next week that cost twice as much and had terrible water pressure. But the floors were solid concrete and there was no basement, and that was all that mattered. The closing papers for my house came through on a Wednesday morning in late February. And honestly, I should have trusted my gut when the real estate agent kept adjusting her glasses and clearing her throat during the final walkthrough. But after 6 months of crashing on my sister's couch following the divorce, any place with my own walls felt like salvation. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside Heights, one of those neighborhoods where people still put up seasonal decorations and kids actually played in the yards. Built in 1978, the split level had good bones underneath the outdated wallpaper and worn carpet, nothing that some sweat equity couldn't fix. What really sold me was the price, almost $40,000 under market value, because the previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan, had died in the master bedroom and the family wanted a quick sale. Death didn't bother me. At my age, having just watched my 10-year marriage flatline, I figured I could handle sharing space with whatever energy Dorothy left behind. My first 2 weeks there passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and making lists of everything that needed fixing, from the leaky kitchen faucet to the wood paneling in the den that belonged in a time capsule. The basement became my designated storage area for things I wasn't ready to deal with yet, mostly photo albums and wedding gifts that felt too complicated to sort through. It was your typical unfinished basement, concrete floors and exposed beams, with an ancient furnace that groaned like it was digesting something whenever it kicked on. That's what I told myself when I first heard the noises anyway. Just the furnace doing its 45-year-old furnace thing. The sounds usually started around 2 in the morning, these soft creaking noises that drifted up through the heating vents. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. And after living in a modern apartment complex where I could hear my neighbor's coffee maker through the walls, a few creaks seemed like a fair trade for actual privacy. Everything changed on a Sunday night in March when I went down to grab my winter boots from storage, because the weather guy promised one last snowstorm before spring. The pull-string light barely reached the corners of the basement, casting these long shadows behind the water heater and the massive boiler that looked like something from a submarine movie. Behind the boiler, tucked into a gap between the unit and the wall, I found 3 Marlboro red cigarette butts arranged in a neat little line on the concrete floor. My whole body went rigid, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach does that horrible flip. Nobody in my family smoked, hadn't had a single visitor who smoked, and the home inspector definitely would have mentioned finding cigarette butts during his inspection. Right next to the butts sat a Poland Spring water bottle, the label peeled halfway off, with maybe 2 inches of water still sloshing around inside. The plastic was soft, like someone had been gripping it recently, and when I picked it up with my sleeve pulled over my hand, the water inside was room temperature, not the icy cold you'd expect from something abandoned in a basement for weeks. I told myself Dorothy's family must have left it when they cleared out her belongings, maybe took smoke breaks while sorting through 40 years of accumulated stuff, even though the house had been empty for 3 months before I moved in. But that night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time the heat kicked on or a tree branch scraped the siding. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had him install new deadbolts on every exterior door, the expensive kind that couldn't be picked by some YouTube tutorial. Then I went through every window in the house, checking locks and adding these metal security bars to the basement windows that the guy at Home Depot assured me would stop anyone bigger than a raccoon. For good measure, I started leaving lights on when I went to bed. The kitchen, the hallway, sometimes the basement too, my electric bill be damned. But even with all that, I kept finding myself standing at the top of the basement stairs at random times, listening for sounds that didn't belong, my hand hovering over the light switch like I was afraid of what I might see if I turned it on. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that living alone after a decade of marriage had made me jumpy and paranoid about normal house stuff. Then came the morning I found my back door unlocked, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one I specifically remembered checking twice before bed because it had become part of my nightly ritual, along with testing every window latch. The door was still closed, just unlocked. The deadbolt turned to the open position like someone had used a key. My coffee mug slipped right out of my hand, shattering on the linoleum and sending hot coffee across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. I grabbed my phone and almost called 911. But what would I say? That my door was unlocked and maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. Instead, I called my brother Kevin, who lived 40 minutes away. And while I waited for him to show up, I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching my own house like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. Kevin spent 2 hours going through the house with me, checking every closet, every corner, even the crawl space above the garage that required a ladder to access. We found nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just that unlocked door that he suggested might be a faulty mechanism, or maybe I'd forgotten despite being certain, absolutely certain, that I'd checked it. But when we went down to the basement to check the window locks, we found something that made Kevin stop talking mid-sentence about getting me a security system. Behind the boiler, in that same spot where I'd found the cigarettes, sat a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and crumpled, with a receipt dated from the previous night at 11:47 p.m. Inside were the remnants of a Big Mac meal, half-eaten, the fries still soft like they'd been sitting there for just a few hours. The smell hit us both at the same time, that distinctive fast food smell that definitely hadn't been there when I'd done laundry in the basement 2 days earlier. Kevin's face went pale, and he pulled out his phone to call the police while ushering me back upstairs, his hand on my back like he was afraid something might grab me if we didn't move fast enough. The police treated it like a standard break-in at first, 2 officers who looked barely older than my nephew taking notes while walking through the house with their hands resting on their utility belts. They found the point of entry within 10 minutes, a basement window on the north side of the house where someone had carefully removed the security bar screws from the outside, the holes hidden behind a rhododendron bush that grew thick against the foundation. The frame showed fresh tool marks where someone had pried it open repeatedly, probably over several nights, working the lock mechanism until they'd figured out how to pop it silently. Officer Ramirez, the one with a thin scar through his left eyebrow, showed me how the intruder had been replacing the screws each time they left, making everything look normal from a casual glance. They documented everything, took photos, dusted for prints around the window and the boiler area, but both officers kept exchanging these looks that made my chest feel tight. When I asked what would happen next, Officer Carson, the younger one with freckles across his nose, said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but admitted that without cameras or witnesses, catching someone who only came at night would be like finding a specific fish in Lake Superior. That afternoon, I spent $300 I didn't really have on security cameras from Best Buy, the kind that sent alerts to your phone when they detected motion. Kevin helped me set them up, one at each entrance, one in the hallway, and two in the basement, including one pointed directly at that window. We also moved my bedroom furniture so my bed sat against the far wall with clear sight lines to both the door and window, and Kevin insisted on installing this metal security bar that wedged under the doorknob, said he'd seen it on some crime show and it actually worked. Before he left, he tried to convince me to stay at his place for a while, but his wife had just had their third kid, and their house was already chaos without adding my drama to it. Instead, I promised to call him every night before bed and first thing in the morning, our own little check-in system that made us both feel better, even though we knew it wouldn't actually stop anything from happening. That first night with the cameras, I sat up in bed with my laptop open, watching the feeds like they were the most important TV show ever made, jumping every time a moth flew past the lens or the timestamp updated. For 3 nights, nothing happened except for a stray cat that triggered the basement camera and nearly gave me a heart attack at 3 a.m. when my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I'd actually started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police visit had scared whoever it was away, that they'd moved on to some other house without cameras and paranoid owners who checked their locks 15 times before bed. Then on Friday night, exhausted from a week of barely sleeping, I made the mistake of taking 2 Benadryl to knock myself out, figuring the camera alerts would wake me if anything happened. I woke up Saturday morning feeling groggy and disoriented, my mouth dry like I'd been breathing through it all night, and when I checked my phone, there were 14 motion alerts from between 1:47 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. My fingers shook so bad I could barely unlock my phone, and when I finally got the camera app open, what I saw made me run to the bathroom and throw up the nothing that was in my stomach, just bile that burned my throat while tears streamed down my face. The footage showed a man entering through the basement window at 1:47 a.m., moving with the kind of confidence that comes from practice, like he'd done this so many times he could navigate my basement in the dark. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a maintenance company jacket, the kind with reflective stripes that made him look like he belonged there if anyone happened to glance through a window. The infrared camera made his eyes look like white circles as he walked directly to the stairs, not hesitating, not searching, just walking like he owned the place. The hallway camera caught him at 2:15 a.m., standing at my bedroom door, his hand on the knob, just standing there for a full 4 minutes without moving. And I realized with horror that he was listening to me breathe, waiting to see if I was truly asleep. Then he opened the door so slowly that it took another 2 minutes for it to fully open and disappeared into my room where I didn't have a camera because who puts a camera in their own bedroom? The next footage was him leaving my room at 3:58 a.m., walking backward while carefully closing the door, and in his hand was my phone charger, the pink one with the butterfly sticker that I'd been looking for all week, assuming I'd misplaced it somewhere. I called 911 while still sitting on my bathroom floor, barely able to form words through the sobbing, and this time they sent 3 patrol cars and a detective named Heather Novak, who had this way of making me feel like she actually believed every word I said. When she watched the footage, She immediately recognized something I'd missed in my panic: a small tattoo on the man's left hand, a distinctive pattern that looked like interlocking triangles. She asked me about previous maintenance work on the house, and suddenly, it clicked. The property management company that handled the rental before Dorothy bought it had sent someone to service the boiler just 2 months before she died. Detective Novak made some calls, and within an hour, she had a name: Carl Brenner, 43 years old, who'd been fired from citywide property services 8 months ago for complaints about entering rental properties without notice. The company still had his photo on file, and even though the baseball cap obscured most of his face in my footage, that hand tattoo was unmistakable. Those same interlocking triangles he'd apparently gotten during his time in the military, according to his employment records. They arrested Carl that same afternoon at his apartment in Fairfield, just 12 miles from my house, and what they found there made Detective Novak call me personally to come to the station, warning me I might want to bring someone for support. In a back room that Carl used as an office, they found hundreds of photos printed from a computer: photos of me sleeping, photos of me cooking dinner, photos of me watching TV on my couch, all taken from inside my house over the past month. But mixed in with mine were other photos, other women in other houses, some dating back 2 years, each set labeled with addresses and dates in neat handwriting on manila folders. He had keys to 17 different properties, including mine, which he'd apparently copied during his maintenance visits, and a notebook where he documented the routines of each house's occupants: when they slept, when they showered, when they were away at work. Detective Novak said in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like it. This methodical invasion of privacy that wasn't about theft or assault, but something else. Some need to exist in other people's spaces without their knowledge, to watch them in their most vulnerable moments. Carl never said a word during interrogation, just sat there with this blank expression, and eventually asked for a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor charged him with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. The trial happened 6 months later, and by then I'd already moved back in with my sister, unable to sleep in that house even after changing every lock and installing an alarm system that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. During the proceedings, we learned that Carl had been doing this since his divorce in 2017, starting with his ex-wife's apartment, then expanding to places he'd serviced during his maintenance job. The prosecutor brought in a psychologist who testified about voyeuristic disorders and violation of privacy as a form of control, using words like parasitic intimacy that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. 16 other women came forward to testify, each with their own version of my story: finding cigarette butts, missing small items, that persistent feeling that someone had been in their space. One woman from Oak Harbor broke down completely when she described finding an impression on her bed's comforter, where someone had laid down next to her while she slept, the shape still visible when she woke up one morning. Carl got 11 years in state prison, eligible for parole in 7 with good behavior, which seems like nothing compared to the life sentence he gave all of us, who can't look at an unlocked door or a basement window without remembering. I sold the house 3 months after the trial, taking a $15,000 loss just to be free of it, and the realtor had to disclose the stalking incident to potential buyers, which meant it sat on the market for 4 months before a young couple from out of state bought it, probably thinking they were getting a deal. Sometimes I drive by there, not intentionally, but that neighborhood sits between my sister's place and the grocery store I like, and I see they've painted it yellow, added a garden, normal life continuing in a space that still shows up in my nightmares. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violation itself, but this one detail from the trial, where they showed a photo from Carl's apartment of a coffee mug he'd taken from my kitchen, my favorite one with a cartoon cat that said "Coffee right meow," sitting on his kitchen counter like it belonged there. He'd been drinking from it every morning while looking at those photos of me, creating this twisted parallel life where he inhabited my spaces even when he wasn't physically there, and that image haunts me more than any footage of him standing in my bedroom doorway, because it means that even when I thought I was alone and safe, some part of my life was always bleeding into his. September in that basement apartment felt like hiding from the world, which was exactly what I needed. Willow Drive wasn't much to look at, just rows of old houses converted into rentals, but at $600 a month I couldn't complain. 29 candles on my last birthday cake, and here I was, starting fresh after Janet and I called it quits. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived upstairs with his wife and kept to himself mostly. During move-in day, the neighbor from next door, Gregory, appeared at my door offering to help with the heavy stuff. He was probably in his 50s, thin guy with calloused hands, said he worked night shifts at some warehouse across town. Made a joke about how our basements were identical, just mirror images of each other, while we struggled to angle my couch down those narrow stairs. Even offered to lend me tools if I needed anything fixed, which seemed neighborly enough at the time. After about 2 weeks of living there, small things in my kitchen started seeming out of place. My coffee mug would be turned handle left when I always left it handle right. The wooden spoon I kept in the drawer next to the stove would migrate to the drawer by the sink. A jar of peanut butter I swore I'd pushed to the back of the cabinet would be sitting at the front edge when I got home from my accounting job downtown. Figured my brain was still scrambled from the divorce stress, especially since I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, scrolling through apartment listings for something better while trying to rebuild my savings. Started doubting myself, even wrote notes about where I put things. The kitchen was cramped, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, old appliances that hummed too loud, cracked linoleum that curled at the edges. Then came that Wednesday in October when things got harder to explain away. Left for work at 7:30 sharp like always, and I specifically remember washing my breakfast bowl and placing it upside down on the dish rack. When I got home around 6 that evening, the bowl was right side up with 3 drops of water pooled at the bottom. Not just moved, but used. The dish soap bottle had shifted from the left side of the sink to the right, and there was a different sponge on the counter, still damp. Called Frank immediately, asked if he'd sent someone down for maintenance, or if maybe his wife had needed to check something. He sounded confused, said nobody had any reason to enter my apartment, reminded me I had the only key besides his emergency copy, which was hanging in his kitchen where it always stayed. That night I couldn't settle down. Kept getting up to double-check the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the doorknob like my dad used to do when we stayed in sketchy motels during road trips. Around 2 in the morning, lying there in the dark, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The distinct sound of a drawer sliding open in my kitchen, that specific sticky catch the silverware drawer made because of the humidity. Then the soft rattle of utensils followed by the drawer rolling shut. My bedroom was only about 15 feet from the kitchen, just a thin wall between us. I held my breath, phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Could hear my pulse hammering in my ears while I waited, listening for footsteps, for any other sound. Another drawer opened, the one with the heavier sound, where I kept the dish towels and oven mitts. The intruder was methodical, unhurried, like someone familiar with the layout. I pressed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment, gave the address twice to make sure she got it right. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, officers were on their way. But then I heard something that made no sense at all. The microwave door opened and closed, followed by the beep of buttons being pressed, but no hum of it actually running. Just someone pressing buttons in the dark. The fridge opened next, that broken seal making its characteristic sucking sound, and I could hear containers being shifted around, the clink of glass jars touching. The sirens came within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours lying there listening to someone moving through my kitchen, like they owned it. When the red and blue lights started flashing through those ground-level windows, the sound stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with footsteps running away, just stopped like someone had hit a switch. The officers knocked loud, announcing themselves, and I practically ran to let them in, explaining about the sounds, pointing toward the kitchen. Two of them went in with flashlights while a third stayed with me by the door. They checked everything, the closets, the bathroom, behind the water heater, even looked up at the ceiling tiles. The kitchen drawers were all closed. Nothing visibly out of place, but I knew someone had been there. The younger officer, Officer Daniels, according to his badge, started asking about windows, pointing out that they were all locked from the inside with no signs of tampering. The door showed no damage either, deadbolt still solid. The older cop, Officer Ruiz, was running his flashlight along the walls, checking for any openings, when he stopped at the back corner of my bedroom. There was a section of wood paneling that looked slightly different from the rest, the grain pattern not quite matching. He pushed on it, and it gave way slightly, like it wasn't properly secured. Called his partner over, and together they pulled at the edges until the whole panel came loose, revealing a rough opening about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Behind that panel was pure darkness that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate at first. Officer Ruiz got down on his knees, aimed his light inside, and immediately pulled back, calling for backup on his radio. The crawl space extended beyond what the beam could reach, with fresh scuff marks in the dust and what looked like knee prints leading away from the opening. They told me to pack a bag, that I couldn't stay there tonight. While we waited for more officers, Gregory from next door came out in his bathrobe, asking about all the commotion, said the lights woke him up. Stood there on his porch with this concerned expression, arms crossed against the cold, watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels went to question him while Ruiz stayed with me, but Gregory just shook his head, said he'd been dead asleep until the sirens. When backup arrived with better equipment, they sent Officer Park, a smaller woman who volunteered to go through the crawl space with a helmet cam and heavy-duty flashlight. We watched the feed on a laptop in the police car, and my stomach turned as the tunnel curved left, then right, clearly man-made with support beams every few feet. After about 30 feet of crawling, she reached another opening, this one covered by a piece of thin plywood that pushed out easily. She emerged into what looked like another basement, and I heard her radio crackle as she described seeing a workbench with tools, shelving units, and a water heater in the corner. Then she turned her light toward the wall and found something that made everyone in the car go silent. Photos taped up in neat rows, dozens of them, all taken from inside my apartment. Me cooking dinner, washing dishes, even one of me sleeping on the couch after a long day. The detective who'd just arrived, Detective Morrison, immediately got a warrant for Gregory's house while Officer Park stayed in position. Within 20 minutes, they were at his door with the paperwork. Gregory answered calmly, like he'd been expecting them, didn't even protest when they told him to step outside. Inside his basement, exactly where Officer Park had emerged, they found the other end of the tunnel system. But it was what they found on his workbench that really got to me. My missing spare key from when I'd first moved in, the one I thought I'd misplaced while unpacking. A notebook with detailed schedules of when I left for work, when I got home, when I typically went to bed. Even had notes about my coffee preference and which drawer I kept the batteries in. The photos went back to my second day living there, hundreds of them organized by date in a filing cabinet. They arrested Gregory right there on his porch, didn't even let him go back inside for shoes. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me through the window, no expression at all, just staring like I was still something to observe. Detective Morrison told me later that Gregory had dug that tunnel over the course of 3 years, long before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a college student named Ryan, had complained about missing food and moved out after just 2 months. But nobody had believed him about someone being in his apartment. They found photos of Ryan too, tucked in a separate folder, along with images of the tenant before him. Gregory had apparently been using that tunnel for years, treating whoever lived there like his personal reality show. Frank felt terrible about the whole thing, refunded my entire security deposit plus 2 months of rent, even though it wasn't his fault. He had contractors come seal up that wall with concrete, no more panels, no more access points. But I couldn't stay there. Moved in with a coworker for a few weeks until I found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown. one with cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Gregory got 18 months for stalking and breaking and entering, which didn't feel like nearly enough. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, listening for drawers opening, for sounds that shouldn't be there. Check my kitchen twice before bed, making sure everything is exactly where I left it. The therapist says it'll fade with time. That hypervigilance after something like this is normal. Maybe she's right, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never live in a basement again. Mason's mother had been gone for 3 months when the noises started in our basement, leaving just the two of us rattling around that split-level house outside Columbus. My son was 9, obsessed with collecting those little metal soldier figures that he'd line up in battle formations across his bedroom floor. We'd grabbed this place in a rush right before school started. One of those 80s builds with yellowish vinyl siding, and a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it kicked on. The realtor had knocked $8,000 off the asking price because of the outdated kitchen and the basement that smelled like wet newspaper. But honestly, we just needed somewhere to start over. Mason claimed the upstairs bedroom while I took the master on the main floor, close enough to hear when those nightmares hit him around 2 or 3 in the morning, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. That first Monday in October, I remember specifically because Mason had just brought home straight A's on his report card. I woke up to this metallic scraping sound coming from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone filing down a piece of steel. The sound stopped and started in intervals, maybe 10 seconds of scraping, then silence, then scraping again. Mixed in with it, I could hear voices, 2 people having what sounded like a completely normal conversation, though the words were too muffled to make out through the floorboards. My first instinct was to check on Mason since he'd been sleepwalking lately, once even making it all the way to the kitchen where I found him trying to pour cereal at 3 in the morning. But when I cracked his door open, there he was, one arm dangling off the bed, mouth slightly open. Those dinosaur sheets twisted around his legs. The talking downstairs continued, casual and unhurried, like 2 guys discussing a project. I pulled the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the metal cold in my palm, and headed for the basement door off the kitchen. The second I turned the doorknob, everything went dead quiet, that kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone holding their breath. I waited there in my boxers and t-shirt, ear pressed against the door, counting to 30 in my head before flipping the light switch. Click. Nothing. The bulb was dead or missing, leaving just a black hole where the stairs descended. I aimed the mag light down those wooden steps, the beam cutting through dust particles that danced in the air like tiny insects. Each stair groaned under my weight, that old wood sound that makes you wonder if the whole thing might give way. The basement stretched out in front of me, mostly empty except for our moving boxes stacked against one wall, and that workbench the previous owners had left behind, its surface covered in rusty brackets and old paint cans. I swept the light across every corner, checking behind the water heater, around the furnace, even inside the utility closet where the electrical panel lived. Nobody. The concrete floor showed no footprints except my own dusty ones from when we'd moved boxes down there. But there was this smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of industrial, like machine oil mixed with something else, maybe rubber or heated plastic. The side door that led out to the backyard was still padlocked from the inside, the tiny window next to it so covered in grime you couldn't see through it even in daylight. For the next few nights I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, just listening. The house had its regular sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heating ducts ticking as they cooled, but nothing from the basement. Started thinking maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was mice in the walls, though mice don't usually have conversations. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it, even joked with my coworker Phil about needing more coffee to stop hallucinating. Then the following Wednesday rolled around and everything changed. I'd taken a half-day off work to deal with some paperwork at Mason's school. Something about updating emergency contact information now that his mother was out of the picture. Got back to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon, pulling into the driveway behind a white van I didn't recognize. No company logos, no writing on the sides, just a plain white panel van with tinted rear windows and a license plate so mud-covered I couldn't read it. Before I could even process why there was a van in my driveway, the side door of my basement burst open, and two men came walking out like they owned the place. Both wore those neon yellow reflective vests, the kind construction workers use, hard hats tucked under their arms carrying what looked like metal detectors or some kind of scanning equipment. The taller one, maybe 6'3" with a thick mustache that reminded me of a push broom, saw me getting out of my car and actually waved, casual as could be. The shorter guy, stocky with arms like ham hocks and a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar, was already heading toward the van's rear doors. They moved with this practiced efficiency. No hesitation, no surprise at seeing me, like running into the homeowner was just part of their regular routine. The tall one called out something about checking the lines, gestured vaguely toward the street where I could see orange cones set up that definitely hadn't been there when I left. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These guys had just walked out of my locked basement, the one with the padlock I'd checked myself that morning. The tall one was already at the van, sliding his equipment into the back while his partner climbed into the driver's seat. When I finally found my voice and asked what the hell they were doing in my house, the tall one just pointed at his vest like that explained everything, mumbled something about Columbia Gas checking for leaks, routine maintenance, should have gotten a notice. His partner had already started the engine, revving it impatiently, and before I could ask another question, the tall guy hopped in and they peeled out, leaving tire marks on my driveway. The whole encounter lasted maybe 45 seconds, but something about how smooth it was, how rehearsed, made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I ran to the basement door, still standing wide open, the padlock dangling from the hasp, somehow unlocked. The mechanism wasn't broken or cut, just opened clean, like they had a key or picked it with professional tools. Down in the basement, that industrial smell hit me stronger than before, and I noticed things I'd missed in the dark with just my flashlight. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor near the wall, like something heavy had been dragged. A section of drywall in the corner looked newer than the rest, the paint slightly brighter white, the texture different. One of our moving boxes had been shifted, and when I checked inside, someone had gone through our old photo albums, a few pictures scattered on the floor beneath the box. The pictures were all of Mason as a baby, birthday parties, first day of kindergarten, him with his mother before she left. My chest got tight seeing those photos touched by strangers' hands, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then stopped, realizing how insane this would sound without proof. Instead, I called Columbia Gas first, going through 3 different customer service representatives, before reaching someone who could actually check service records. The woman on the phone, Sharon, sounded increasingly concerned as she searched their system, finally telling me in this careful voice that no Columbia Gas crews had been dispatched to my address in over 2 years, and certainly not today. She asked if I wanted to file a report about impersonation, said it was a serious crime, that people sometimes posed as utility workers to case houses for burglaries. While she was talking, I walked around the basement perimeter, running my hand along the walls, and that's when I felt it, a draft coming from behind that newer section of drywall. Not strong, but definitely there, cold air flowing from somewhere it shouldn't be. Sharon was still talking about security protocols when I grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench and started prying at the edge of that fresh drywall section. The drywall came away easier than it should have, just held in place with a few finishing nails, revealing a hole about 3 feet wide cut straight through the concrete foundation. Professional work, smooth edges, probably done with a concrete saw, the kind contractors use for major renovations. Beyond the hole was a corrugated metal pipe, one of those big storm drain tubes that run under neighborhoods to handle rainwater runoff. The pipe had to be at least 4 feet in diameter, big enough for a grown man to walk through if he hunched over a bit. I could see footprints in the sediment at the bottom, lots of them, going both directions, and that industrial smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the musty stench of stagnant water and decay. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of the tunnel in either direction, just disappeared into blackness that seemed to go on forever. Called 911 right then, told them about the break-in, the fake utility workers, and this tunnel I just discovered leading straight into the storm drain system. The cops showed up within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars, and then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Hoffman. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as I walked him through what happened. When he saw the tunnel opening, he immediately called for backup and a crime scene unit, then got on his radio requesting someone from the city's public works department. While we waited, he asked me detailed questions about the 2 men, had me describe everything I could remember, their height, weight, distinguishing features, the van, even the way they walked. The crime scene techs arrived and started photographing everything, dusting for prints on the drywall edges and the padlock, taking samples of the sediment from inside the tunnel entrance. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, told Hoffman she could see tool marks on the concrete, definitely a professional job, probably took days to cut through. The guy from Public Works showed up about an hour later, an older man named Eddie who'd been working the city sewers for 23 years, knew every pipe and drain in Columbus like the back of his hand. He took one look at the tunnel entrance and his face went pale, started muttering about how this section of storm drain had been sealed off in 2016 after a homeless camp got flooded out during heavy rains. Said the city had welded shut all the access points, installed security grates, the whole 9 yards, specifically to keep people from getting in there. But here was proof someone had not only gotten in but had been using it as their own private highway under the neighborhood. Eddie pulled up schematics on his tablet, showing Hoffman where the drain ran, and my stomach dropped when I saw it connected to at least 12 other houses on our street, with multiple entry points that led to maintenance hatches scattered throughout the area. Any of those houses could have the same kind of hidden entrance, and the people living there would never know. Hoffman made the decision to send officers into the tunnel while we evacuated to a hotel. Said it wasn't safe for Mason and me to stay there until they figured out what they were dealing with. I packed bags for both of us while trying not to alarm Mason. Told him we were having an adventure, like camping but in a hotel with a pool. Poor kid was excited about the pool, had no idea why his dad's hands were shaking while folding his dinosaur pajamas. Before we left, I watched them send in 2 officers wearing hazmat suits and headlamps, tethered to safety lines in case the tunnel had any surprises. They came back out 20 minutes later with evidence bags full of stuff they'd found down there. Copper piping that had been stripped from somewhere, what looked like mail from different addresses, even a laptop in a waterproof case. One of the officers, his face sheet white despite the exertion, told Hoffman they'd found makeshift camps set up at various points, sleeping bags, camp stoves, stockpiles of food, and something else that made him stop talking when he noticed I was listening. Hoffman walked me to my car, said they'd post an officer at the hotel, gave me his card with his personal cell number written on the back, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anyone tried to contact me. That night at the hotel, Mason splashed in the pool while I sat on a plastic chair watching him, my phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from Hoffman. They'd arrested 6 people by midnight, all found at different points in the tunnel system, including the 2 guys I'd described from my driveway. The tall one with the mustache turned out to be a former city employee who'd been fired from the water department 5 years ago for stealing equipment. His partner was his cousin, both of them with rap sheets full of burglary and theft charges going back a decade. The other 4 were people nobody expected, a woman who worked at a nearby grocery store, 2 brothers who ran a scrap metal business, and most disturbing, a man who'd been reported missing by his family 3 years ago. They'd been living down there, had turned that abandoned storm drain into their own underground network, complete with stolen electricity tapped from junction boxes and water siphoned from supply lines. The metallic scraping I'd heard that first night was them cutting through pipes in neighboring basements, harvesting copper to sell, and the talking was them planning which house to hit next. What really got me was when Hoffman called the next morning to tell me what else they'd discovered. Those photos of Mason they'd been looking through weren't random curiosity. They'd found notebooks in one of the camps with detailed information about every family on our street, schedules, when people left for work, when kids got home from school, who had dogs, who had security systems. My house was marked as single father, one child, no dog, basic locks, basement access confirmed. They'd been watching us for weeks before they even cut through our foundation, knew exactly when they could work without being heard, knew I wouldn't be home that Wednesday afternoon because they'd seen me leave at the same time the previous week for Mason's school appointment. The whole operation was sophisticated in a way that made my skin prickle. These weren't just random criminals, but people who'd turned violating others' homes into a science. The city ended up evacuating the entire street for a week, while they sealed every access point with reinforced concrete, installed monitoring equipment, and swept the whole system for anyone else who might be down there. They found 2 more people on the 3rd day, living so deep in the system they hadn't even known about the arrests, surviving on canned goods and rainwater like some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario playing out beneath our suburban street. We never went back to that house. I broke the lease, took the financial hit, didn't care about losing the security deposit or the penalties. Found us the apartment on the 7th floor of a building downtown, one with a doorman, security cameras in every hallway, and most importantly, no basement. Mason adjusted better than I expected, though he still asks sometimes why we had to move so suddenly, why we couldn't go back for the rest of his toys. I tell him the house had problems. Leave it at that. Figure when he's older I'll explain the whole thing if he really wants to know. The nightmares he'd been having after his mother left actually stopped after we moved. Like somehow his subconscious knew we were safer in that concrete tower than we'd ever been in that house with its hidden vulnerabilities. All 8 people they arrested got prison time, sentences ranging from 18 months to 7 years for the ringleaders, though that feels like nothing compared to the violation they put our whole neighborhood through. 6 months later, I ran into one of our old neighbors at a Kroger across town, a woman named Beth who'd lived 3 houses down from us. She told me they'd sold too, couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening literally beneath their feet all that time. Said the whole street had basically emptied out within a year, property values tanked, and the city was still dealing with lawsuits from families who'd discovered evidence of intrusion in their homes during the investigation. Pictures missing, items moved, food taken from refrigerators, little violations that suddenly made sense in the context of what had been discovered. She mentioned they'd found DNA evidence in 7 different houses, proving the tunnel people had been coming up into homes for months, maybe years, whenever they knew families were away. The strangest part was learning later from the prosecution files that the man who'd been missing for 3 years, the one living in the tunnels, had actually chosen to be there, had left his family to join this underground community because he believed society above ground was collapsing. Even now, writing this at my desk in our new place with the city lights twinkling outside, I still check the locks 3 times before bed, still wake up at the slightest unusual sound, still feel that primitive fear when I hear something that reminds me of metal scraping against concrete. The notification from RoomShare popped up on my phone during a particularly rough month in 2022, right when Jenna and I were staring at our credit card statements spread across the kitchen table. We'd bought the house in Denver the previous year, convinced we could handle the mortgage on our combined salaries. But between the car breaking down and her dad's medical bills, things had gotten tight. The basement had its own entrance around the side of the house, a full bathroom, and enough space for someone to live comfortably, so when Jenna suggested renting it out, I figured why not. The app made everything seem so easy and safe, with background checks and verified profiles. And within 3 days we had our first serious inquiry from someone named Thomas Brennan, who said he worked nights at a warehouse and just needed a quiet place to sleep during the day. Thomas showed up on a Saturday morning to view the space, and I remember thinking how unremarkable he looked. Just an average guy in his 40s with thinning brown hair and clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to blend in, khakis and a plain blue polo shirt. He barely spoke above a whisper when he talked, had this way of nodding along to everything we said, and paid 3 months up front in cash, which should have been my first red flag, but honestly just felt like a relief at the time. He moved in with just 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, said he traveled light because of his job, and for the first couple weeks everything seemed perfect. He was so quiet we sometimes forgot he was even down there, never asked for anything, never complained about the old water heater that made that weird knocking sound, and always left his rent money in an envelope taped to our back door on the 1st of each month, even though I told him he could just transfer it through the app. About a month in, Jenna started mentioning these little things that didn't quite add up, like how she'd never heard him use the microwave or the TV we'd left down there, never smelled food cooking, never heard water running except for the toilet flushing occasionally. She worked from home doing medical transcription and said the basement was dead silent all day, even though Thomas supposedly slept during those hours after his night shifts. We'd see him leaving around 9 at night through the side entrance, always carrying the same black backpack, always wearing dark clothes, and he'd return around 6 in the morning, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement through the basement window at odd hours when he should have been at work. The strangest part was the darkness. We never saw lights on down there, not even the glow from a phone screen or laptop, just complete blackness behind those small rectangular windows at ground level. One evening I went down to check the water meter, which was in a utility closet in the basement hallway, and noticed Thomas had installed a deadbolt on his door from the inside, one of those heavy-duty ones you'd see on a front door. When I knocked to ask about it, just making conversation really, he opened the door maybe 3 inches, his face partially hidden in the shadows, and explained in that soft voice that he had expensive equipment for his work and felt better with extra security. The smell that came from his room was odd, not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical, like fresh plastic mixed with something metallic, and I could hear this faint humming sound, maybe a fan or some kind of machine running. He must have seen me trying to peer past him because he shifted his body to block my view completely, then thanked me for understanding about the lock and gently closed the door before I could respond. Jenna had this habit of doing yoga in our bedroom every morning, and one day in early December she came downstairs looking puzzled, saying she kept hearing these tiny clicking sounds while she was in downward dog, like someone tapping a pencil against wood but coming from below. Our bedroom was directly above Thomas's living area, and when we both went upstairs to listen, sure enough, there were these intermittent clicking noises, so faint you had to really concentrate to hear them. I figured maybe he had some kind of hobby, model building or something. People who work nights often have unusual ways to unwind, but Jenna started changing in the bathroom after that. Said she just felt weird about it, even though there was no logical reason. We also noticed our cat, Mango, absolutely refused to go near the basement door anymore. Would hiss and arch his back if we even carried him close to it, which was bizarre because he used to love sleeping on the warm spot where the heating vent came up through the floor there. The night everything went to hell started with me jerking awake at 2 in the morning to the sound of water rushing through the walls, that unmistakable whoosh that means a pipe has given way somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the basement door, pounding on it and shouting for Thomas, but got no response, even though his car was in the driveway. The water was already seeping under the door into our hallway, and I could hear it spraying full force somewhere below. I threw my shoulder against the door hard. Once, twice, and on the third hit the frame splintered, and the deadbolt ripped free from the wood. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight beam caught the water first, cascading from a burst pipe in the ceiling, soaking everything. But as I swung the light around looking for the shutoff valve, I saw something that made my brain just stop processing for a second. The ceiling was covered in holes, dozens of them, each about the width of a quarter, drilled in precise patterns across the drywall. Some had thin cables snaking through them, others were plugged with what looked like small glass lenses, and all of them were positioned directly under the rooms where Jenna and I spent our time. My flashlight caught more details as I stood there in shock. A desk covered in monitors showing grainy green-tinted footage, boxes of electronic equipment I couldn't identify, and notebooks filled with handwritten schedules and observations. The monitors were still running on battery backup, and I could see our living room from above, our kitchen, and worst of all, our bedroom, all filmed from those tiny holes he'd so carefully hidden in the textured ceiling upstairs. One screen showed Jenna asleep in our bed at that very moment, and another had folders labeled with dates going back to the day Thomas moved in. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Thomas was suddenly there, not in work clothes but in dark athletic gear, his face completely different without the meek expression he usually wore, now sharp and focused and calculating. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at his equipment, then back at me, like he was doing math in his head about what would happen next. I started backing toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at his face, and told him the police were already on their way, which was a lie but seemed like the right thing to say. He smiled then, not the nervous smile I'd seen before, but something confident and practiced, and said in a voice much deeper than his usual whisper that I had no idea how many places he'd been, or how many people had thought they were safe in their own homes. Then he moved faster than I expected, not toward me, but to his desk, grabbing something before sprinting past me and up the stairs, shoving me hard into the wall as he went. By the time I got upstairs, Jenna was standing in the hallway with her phone, saying she'd heard the crash and already called 911, but Thomas was gone, the front door wide open and cold December air rushing in. His car was still in the driveway, which meant he'd fled on foot, probably had another vehicle stashed nearby or someone waiting to pick him up. The whole thing planned out like everything else he'd done. The police arrived within minutes, and I took them down to the basement, which was now ankle-deep in water from the still gushing pipe. But the equipment was still there, those monitors still glowing with their sick green light, showing every private moment we thought we'd had. The detective who specialized in these cases told us to pack some things and find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. Said Thomas had likely been recording everything for months, possibly selling the footage or just keeping it for his own twisted reasons. The investigation revealed things that still make me nauseous when I think about them, like how Thomas Brennan wasn't even his real name, just one of at least 6 identities they could trace. The detective showed us photos from other rental properties in Colorado and Wyoming, where similar setups had been found. Always basement apartments, always couples or single women living above, always the same pattern of holes drilled with surgical precision. They found receipt copies in his desk for specialty surveillance equipment, ordered to different addresses, some dating back 3 years, and a laptop with encrypted files the FBI tech team was still trying to crack. The worst part was learning from the neighbors that they'd seen someone matching his description at odd hours, sometimes just standing in our backyard at night, looking up at our windows, and they'd assumed it was just the tenant getting some air, nothing worth mentioning. We stayed in a hotel for a week while contractors repaired the water damage and patched all those holes, though knowing where each one had been still makes my skin itch when I walk through the house. Jenna couldn't sleep for months, would wake up checking the ceiling with her phone's flashlight, convinced she could hear that clicking sound again, even though Thomas was long gone. We had a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors, the whole deal, which felt ironic given what had happened, trading one form of surveillance for another. The detective called a few times with updates, said they'd connected Thomas to at least 12 similar cases across 4 states, but he'd vanished completely, probably using another identity they hadn't uncovered yet, maybe already setting up in another basement somewhere, drilling his neat little holes while some unsuspecting couple slept above him. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when I swear I saw him across the street. Same height, same thinning hair, wearing those generic clothes meant to blend into any crowd. My whole body went rigid, and I stood there watching as he walked into a hardware store, probably buying more drill bits, more tiny cameras, more cables to snake through someone else's ceiling. I called the detective immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone, and the store's security footage showed someone who looked similar but not quite the same, though the detective admitted these guys were experts at changing their appearance just enough to create doubt. We ended up selling the house 2 months after that. Took a loss on it, but didn't care. Just needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere without a basement. Somewhere we could shower and sleep and live without wondering what might be watching from inside the walls. The new buyers were a young family with kids, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything. But my lawyer said we'd disclosed what we legally had to, and anything more might be seen as trying to sabotage the sale. So I just handed over the keys and hoped they'd never need to find out why we'd installed so many locks. The conference in Seattle wasn't something I could skip, not with the promotion hanging in the balance and my boss watching every move I made. Hotels downtown were charging $300 a night minimum, which would have blown through my travel allowance in 2 days. So I scrolled through Airbnb until I found something reasonable. $60 a night for a whole house seemed too good to pass up, even if it meant a 40-minute drive to the convention center each morning. The listing showed a charming craftsman-style place with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures, the kind of house my grandmother would have loved. The host, Martin, had stellar reviews, mostly from business travelers like me who praised his quick responses in the peaceful neighborhood. I booked 5 nights without hesitation, figuring I'd just need a clean bed and a hot shower after 12-hour days at the conference. Martin met me at the house on Sunday evening, right as the October rain started picking up. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that looked like he'd ironed them twice. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and he maintained this intense eye contact while explaining the house rules, like he was trying to memorize my face. The place was exactly as advertised, maybe even nicer, with fresh flowers on the dining table and a welcome basket full of local coffee and snacks. He walked me through each room, pointing out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the router, the extra towels in the linen closet. When we reached the hallway, he stopped at a white door near the kitchen and his whole demeanor shifted. His voice dropped lower, more serious, as he explained that this was the basement door, and it needed to stay locked at all times. Something about ongoing renovations, exposed wiring, insurance liability, the usual concerns that property owners have. He actually pulled on the handle to show me it was secured, then watched me nod in understanding before his smile returned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I'd leave early for the conference, grabbing coffee from the kitchen while the house sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and return after 10 each night, too exhausted to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The house had this settled quietness that old places develop, with the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to temperature changes, or pipes ticking behind the walls. On Monday night, I'd actually stood in the hallway eating takeout Chinese food, staring at that basement door while wondering what kind of renovation required such strict warnings. The door looked ancient, with layers of white paint that had yellowed at the edges, and an old-fashioned keyhole beneath the modern deadbolt Martin had installed. I even bent down once to peek through the keyhole, seeing nothing but black, before feeling ridiculous and heading to bed. Wednesday changed everything. The conference ended early due to a speaker cancellation, so I got back to the house around 6 instead of my usual 10:30. I decided to take advantage of the extra time, pouring myself wine from a bottle I'd bought and settling onto the couch with my laptop to review presentations. The house felt different in the evening light, more lived in somehow, like someone had just stepped out for groceries. Around 8, while I was deep in a spreadsheet, I heard this rhythmic creaking from somewhere below. My first thought was the washing machine, maybe on an automatic cycle, but Martin hadn't mentioned any appliances in the basement. The sound continued for maybe 10 minutes, steady and deliberate like footsteps pacing back and forth on old wooden stairs. I actually muted my laptop and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to locate the source, but the moment I did, the sound stopped completely, as if someone down there had heard me listening. I texted Martin about the noise, trying to keep it casual, asking if there was any automated equipment in the basement that might be running. He replied within seconds, which struck me as odd for 8 at night, saying it was probably just the old boiler system settling for the evening and apologizing if it disturbed my work. His response should have been reassuring, but the speed of it, like he'd been waiting for my message, made me uneasy. I went back to my spreadsheets, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me look up, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that hallway where the basement door waited. Around 9, I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood, just once. Brief but distinct. I grabbed my phone to text Martin again, but stopped, realizing how paranoid I'd sound complaining about every little noise in an old house. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom, listening to the house breathe around me, trying to separate normal settling sounds from anything else. Sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1, I heard the definitive sound of footsteps beneath the floorboards. Not the random creaking of old wood, but a clear pattern. 7 steps one way, a pause, 7 steps back. The counting became automatic, something my brain did without permission, and with each repetition, the pause grew longer. During one of these pauses, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. The distinct sound of a doorknob turning, that specific metallic click and release. I knew immediately which door it was, even from the bedroom. My phone was in my hand before I'd made the conscious decision to grab it, thumb hovering over the emergency call button while I strained to hear what would come next. The footsteps that followed were different, heavier and more deliberate, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I could track them by the way different floorboards complained under the weight, each creak mapping out a path through the house I'd walked myself just hours earlier. They stopped near the couch where I'd been working, and I heard the unmistakable sound of papers rustling. My work documents were still spread across the coffee table, including contracts with my company's letterhead, my business cards, even my travel itinerary with my home address printed at the top. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone reading, absorbing information. Then came a sound that nearly made me call out, the wine glass I'd left on the table being picked up and set down again, the faint ring of glass meeting wood echoing in the darkness. I did the stupidest thing possible. I got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my face against the wood to listen better. The living room was maybe 20 feet away, a straight shot down the hallway, and whoever was out there would only need to turn the corner to see my door. But I had to know if this was real or if I was having some kind of exhaustion-induced breakdown. My hand found the doorknob, turned it with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound, and I opened the door just enough to peer out with one eye. The hallway was dark, but streetlight from the living room windows created this dim gray twilight, enough to see shapes and shadows. And there, standing beside the coffee table with my papers in his hands, was Martin. He was wearing different clothes than when he'd met me on Sunday, a worn undershirt and sweatpants like he'd been sleeping. But what made me pull back and nearly gasp aloud was realizing he was barefoot, and his feet were dirty, covered in what looked like dust or soil, leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. I closed the door with infinite care, turned the lock so slowly that it took nearly 30 seconds for the bolt to fully engage, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more insane than the last. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and had a spare key. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was checking on the property. But none of that explained why he'd come through the basement or why he was going through my personal papers at 1 a.m. I could hear him moving again, those dirty feet padding across the floor toward the kitchen. The refrigerator opened, stayed open for maybe a minute, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that became terrifying because they shouldn't be happening. I started recording video on my phone, not of him, but of the door crack where light might show movement, evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The next sound was worse than anything before. The squeak of weight settling onto the couch springs, like he was making himself comfortable in the living room. I could picture him out there, maybe still holding my papers, sitting in the dark just 30 feet from where I was hiding. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I made the decision to wait him out, to stay locked in this room until daylight, then get out and never come back. but around 2:30, after nearly an hour of silence, I heard him stand and walk back toward the hallway. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and I swear I could hear breathing. This slow, measured rhythm, like someone trying to detect signs of consciousness from within. My own breath stopped entirely, my whole body rigid under the covers where I dove the moment he'd started moving. The doorknob rattled once, just a gentle test, finding it locked. Then nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Absolute stillness before those footsteps retreated back toward the kitchen, and that basement door opened and closed with its familiar creak. I didn't sleep, not for 1 second. I sat on that bed with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, watching the door and listening to every sound the house made for the rest of the night. When gray dawn light finally crept through the curtains, I threw everything into my suitcase without folding anything, not caring about wrinkles or organization. I waited until 6:30, when the neighborhood would have people heading to work, witnesses around if something went wrong, then unlocked my door and walked straight to my car without looking anywhere but forward. Before driving away, though, I had to know. I walked around the back of the house, my keys gripped between my fingers like claws, until I found it. A storm door cellar entrance, the kind with angled metal doors that lead from outside directly into the basement. The padlock that should have secured it was hanging open, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, where the doors had been repeatedly opened. The grass around it was worn down to bare earth in a rough path that led to a cluster of trees where the property line ended. When the police searched the basement 3 hours later, after I'd called them from a Starbucks parking lot 10 miles away, they found a makeshift living space behind the boiler. A sleeping bag, camp stove, boxes of canned food, and a milk crate full of items taken from previous guests. A watch, several driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, phone chargers, even underwear. Martin had been living down there for months, they said, entering through that outside entrance and moving through the house at night while guests slept above him. The detective who called me later said they'd found notebooks where he'd written detailed observations about each guest, what time they went to bed, their daily routines, phone conversations he'd overheard through the floorboards. My name was already there, along with notes about my conference schedule and a sketch of my face that was disturbingly accurate. They arrested him at his actual apartment across town, where he'd been maintaining the appearance of a normal life while essentially living beneath his rental property, surfacing at night like some kind of human rodent to study the people who'd paid him to feel safe. There are nights when silence feels heavier than usual, like the whole house is waiting for something to happen. I remember one of those nights vividly, mostly because it started out so ordinary. I had just come home after another long evening shift at the diner where I worked. My routine was always the same: drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and heat up whatever leftovers were still in the fridge. That night, though, when I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway that led to the basement door. The light was on down there, which didn't make sense. I never used the basement except to store tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I must have flipped the switch by accident one morning when I was half awake. Still, something about that dim yellow light spilling under the door made me uneasy. The basement always had this strange, still air about it, like time stopped at the bottom of those steps. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was just being ridiculous. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. I almost turned it off right then, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went down, I noticed how thick the dust layer had gotten since the last time I'd been there. You could see every small print from mice, the outline of old pipes, and my own footprints from months ago. Near the far wall, close to the furnace, I spotted something new. A few half-formed boot prints, much larger than my own. The shape was distinct, almost recent, like someone had walked there not long ago and disturbed the dust just enough to leave a clear mark. I told myself maybe the plumber had left them when he came by earlier that year, but deep down, I knew he never walked that far in. That image of those footprints stuck with me the rest of the night. I went back upstairs, double-checked every lock, and tried to sleep with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint metallic sound echoing through the vents, like something lightly brushing against the inside of the ducts. Came again, slower this time, followed by a hollow tap that seemed to move across the house. I stared at the ceiling, counting each sound, pretending it was just the heating system settling. But the truth was, I had never heard those noises before. The next morning, I checked the basement again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the noise. Everything looked the same cold air, same quiet hum from the furnace. Still, I could not stop staring at those footprints. I knelt down, touched the dust, and realized the top layer seemed freshly disturbed again, like someone had stepped there after I had gone upstairs. I told myself it must have been airflow from the vents, or maybe a small animal. But that explanation did not sit right. The house was sealed up tight, and I had not seen a single mouse in years. 2 nights later, the metallic sounds returned, sharper this time. They moved from one vent to another, like something crawling through the ductwork. Then came a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. It was so subtle that I almost ignored it, but the smell lingered long enough for me to notice where it came from, the vent near my bed. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just listening. The furnace was off. The house was still. But that smell, cheap, acrid tobacco, seeped out from below, mixing with the stale air of my room. I could not remember the last time anyone had smoked inside this house. I barely slept that night, and when dawn came, I decided to check the basement again. The air down there was heavier, colder, and the smell of smoke was stronger. I noticed a few ashes on the concrete near the furnace, tiny gray flakes scattered close to the vent opening. That was when I noticed something odd behind the furnace. There was a narrow panel of metal, slightly misaligned. When I crouched and looked closer, I realized it was not part of the furnace at all, but a piece of sheet metal wedged over a small opening in the wall. Behind it, a dark void stretched deeper than I could see. I hesitated before pulling it aside. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. When I finally shifted the metal enough to look inside, a faint draft hit my face, cool and stale. The crawl space was cramped and uneven, with old insulation hanging like cobwebs. I shined my phone's flashlight in and saw a few things that made my chest tighten. A crumpled blanket, an empty can of beans, and a half-burned cigarette resting on a brick. Someone had been staying down there, watching, listening. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do next. I stood there, gripping the edge of the furnace, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was not just that someone had been living down there, it was that they had been close enough to hear everything I did. Every step, every door opening, every phone call. I thought about the faint sounds I'd brushed off for weeks. It all fit together now in the worst possible way. The vent outside must have been their entrance, hidden behind the shrubs near the side of the house. I never noticed it before because I hardly went back there. I backed away and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. The dispatcher told me to wait outside until officers arrived. Standing in the driveway, I could see the faint glow of my basement light through the small window near the ground. It was strange, knowing that someone might still be in there, maybe watching me from the shadows. When the officers finally arrived, they went inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. I heard one of them yell something, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. They pulled out a man who looked like he had not slept in days. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. The officers said he had been sneaking in at night through the vent, hiding in that crawl space whenever I was home. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a small radio tuned to static. He had made himself comfortable in my walls, using the ducts to listen to me move from room to room. The realization made my chest feel hollow. I had been living above him, completely unaware, for who knows how long. After they took him away, I had every vent sealed and the crawl space welded shut. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Sometimes late at night, I still catch myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to see that faint yellow light seeping out again. It has been months since it happened, but I cannot shake the feeling that the silence in this house is not empty anymore. It feels like it is waiting, listening, just like he once did. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My phone buzzed on a Wednesday morning in March 2024, right when I was pouring my second cup of coffee before heading to the accounting firm, where I'd been crunching numbers for the past 6 years. The name on the screen made me nearly drop the mug. Danielle Voss. I had not heard from her since the summer after we graduated from college together in 2015, almost 9 years of complete radio silence. We had been inseparable throughout our entire 4 years at the university, the kind of friendship where people assumed we were sisters. Then came the fallout, a messy argument over a guy I was dating at the time, words that cut too deep, and suddenly she vanished from my life like smoke dissolving into air. I stood there in my kitchen, steam rising from my coffee, staring at the message notification. My cat Luna rubbed against my ankles, oblivious to the way my heart had started pounding against my ribs. The message was simple, almost painfully so. Hey Meg, I know it's been forever. I've done a lot of growing. Would love to talk if you're open to it. I spent the entire workday distracted, making small errors on spreadsheets that my supervisor Colleen had to point out twice. My coworker and closest friend Diane noticed something was wrong during our lunch break at the little sandwich shop across the street from our office building on Garrison Avenue. I showed her the text, and she raised an eyebrow, chewing slowly on her turkey wrap. Diane had heard all my stories about Danielle over the years, the good ones from college, and the ugly ending that had left me crying for weeks back then. She asked me what I was going to do, and I told her I did not know yet. Part of me wanted to ignore the message entirely, to protect the peace I had built in my life here in Richmond. I had my routine, my apartment with the exposed brick walls that I loved, my book club that met every other Saturday, my parents just a 2-hour drive away in the suburbs. But another part of me, the part that still remembered laughing until my stomach hurt with Danielle in our cramped dorm room, wondered if people really could change. By the time I got home that evening, I had convinced myself that one conversation would not hurt. I typed back, "Hey Danny, I'm open to talking. We met that Saturday at a coffee shop downtown called the Copper Kettle, a place with mismatched vintage chairs and the smell of fresh pastries baked on site every morning." Danielle was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. She looked different than I remembered, thinner with her dark hair cut shorter just above her shoulders, and there were faint lines around her eyes that had not been there before. When she saw me, her whole face changed, lighting up with a warmth that caught me off guard. She stood up and hugged me tight, holding on for just a beat longer than felt natural. I noticed she smelled like lavender, the same perfume she used to wear back in college. We sat down and she immediately started talking, telling me about the past 9 years in fragments, a failed engagement, a move to Denver that did not work out, therapy that helped her understand why she had been so possessive and jealous back then. She used those exact words, possessive and jealous, and she looked me right in the eyes when she said them. I appreciated the honesty more than I expected. She told me she had thought about reaching out for years but was too ashamed, too afraid I would reject her. The conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, I felt like I was talking to someone familiar and new at the same time. The Danielle I had loved, but softer, more self-aware. She asked about my life with genuine curiosity, wanting to know about my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. I told her I had been dating a guy named Spencer for about 8 months, Nothing too serious yet, but it was going well. She smiled at that, said she was happy for me, though her eyes flickered away for just a second when I mentioned his name. I did not think much of it at the time. We exchanged numbers again, and she asked if we could do this more often. I said yes. Walking back to my car that afternoon, I felt a lightness in my chest that surprised me. Diane called me that night to ask how it went, and I told her it was good, really good. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, then said she was glad but to be careful. Old patterns have a way of coming back, she said. I laughed it off and told her Danielle had changed. Looking at it now, I wish I had listened to Diane more carefully. I wish I had paid attention to that flicker in Danielle's eyes when I mentioned Spencer's name. Over the next few weeks, Danielle became a constant presence in my life again. We texted every day, sometimes dozens of messages back and forth. She wanted to know what I was doing, what I had for lunch, how my meetings went. At first, it felt nice, like having that close friendship back, the kind where someone actually cares about the small details of your day. She started showing up at my apartment with little gifts, a candle she thought I would like, a book by an author we used to read together, homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper. One evening she arrived with a framed photo from our sophomore year, the two of us at a Halloween party dressed as characters from some movie we had been obsessed with. I hung it on my wall because it seemed rude not to, and her face lit up when she saw it there. She began suggesting we spend more time together on weekends, and when I mentioned I had plans with Spencer on a particular Saturday, her expression changed for just a moment. It was quick, a tightening around her mouth, but she recovered fast and said of course she understood, maybe another time. That night she texted me 17 times between 9 and midnight, just checking in, just wanting to chat, just wondering if I was having fun. Spencer noticed before I did. He brought it up one Sunday morning while we were making breakfast at his place, cracking eggs into a bowl, while I sliced bread for toast. He said Danielle seemed intense, that every time he came up in conversation she got this look on her face. I told him she was just adjusting, that she had been through a lot and was probably lonely. He nodded but did not look convinced. A few days later, Danielle asked me to have dinner with her on Friday night, and when I told her I already had plans with Spencer, she went quiet. Then she said she was worried about me, that Spencer seemed controlling, that she had noticed how much time he demanded from me. I was stunned. Spencer was the least controlling person I knew. He encouraged me to see my friends, never checked my phone, gave me space whenever I needed it. I told Danielle she was wrong, that she did not know him well enough to say something like that. She apologized quickly, said she was just looking out for me, said she did not want to see me get hurt like last time. Like last time. The guy we had fought over 9 years ago. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I pushed it down and changed the subject. The isolation happened so gradually that I almost did not notice it. Danielle started making comments about Diane, little things that seemed harmless at first. She mentioned that Diane had given her a strange look when she stopped by my office one afternoon to bring me lunch. She said she overheard Diane making a sarcastic comment about her in the break room. She wondered out loud why Diane seemed so possessive of my time, why she always wanted to have lunch with me, why she texted me so much. The irony was not lost on me, but Danielle delivered these observations with such genuine concern that I found myself second-guessing my own perceptions. One day she told me that Diane had said something cruel about my appearance behind my back, something about how I had gained weight and looked tired lately. I confronted Diane about it, and she looked at me like I had lost my mind. She swore she never said anything like that, and the hurt in her eyes was real. I believed her, but the damage was already done. Things became awkward between us after that. Diane started keeping her distance, eating lunch at her desk instead of inviting me to the sandwich shop. I told myself it was fine, that friendships went through phases, but part of me knew exactly what was happening. Danielle was cutting away the people around me, one thread at a time. Then the strange things started happening at my apartment. Small things at first. I would come home and find a window unlocked that I was certain I had locked. My mail would be sitting on my kitchen counter instead of in the mailbox downstairs. One evening I found a coffee mug in my sink that I had not used, still warm, with a faint ring of lipstick on the rim that matched the shade Danielle always wore. I called her and asked if she had been in my apartment, and she laughed and said, "Of course not. Why would I think that?" But something in her voice sounded amused, almost pleased that I had noticed. A few days later I came home from work and found a new throw pillow on my couch, a deep burgundy color that I had never seen before. When I mentioned it to Danielle the next time we talked, she smiled and said she had bought it for me as a surprise, that my building manager had let her in because she had explained she was my best friend and wanted to do something nice. She said it so casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I did not know how to respond. I thanked her, but my voice came out thin and strange. That night I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that this was all just her being thoughtful, being a good friend. But I kept thinking about that coffee mug, the warmth of it, the lipstick on the rim. Things got worse at work too. I started noticing Danielle's car in the parking garage across from my office building. A silver Nissan with a dent on the rear bumper that she had told me about weeks earlier. The first time I saw it, I thought maybe she was visiting someone nearby or running errands in the area. The second time, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The third time, I watched from my office window on the 4th floor as she sat in the driver's seat for over an hour, not moving, just staring at the building entrance. When I texted her asking what she was up to, she replied immediately saying she was at home doing laundry. I looked back out the window and saw her phone light up in her hand inside the car. She glanced down at it, typed something, and my phone buzzed with another message, a photo of a laundry basket with clothes in it. She had that photo ready. She had prepared for me to ask. That evening she called me, her voice sweet and concerned, asking if everything was okay because I had seemed distant lately. I told her I was just stressed with work, and she offered to come over and keep me company. I said no, that I needed some time alone. There was a long pause on the line before she said she understood, but her tone had shifted into something flat and cold. She hung up without saying goodbye. Spencer and I had a fight that weekend, our first real argument since we started dating. He told me he was worried that Danielle was not healthy for me, that he had done some searching online and found her social media accounts from Denver. He showed me the posts, dozens of them about a woman named Christy, someone Danielle had described as her best friend out there. The posts started warm and affectionate, then became accusatory and bitter, filled with comments about betrayal and abandonment. The final post was a photo of Christy's house with a caption that read, "Some people don't deserve peace." Spencer asked me if I saw the pattern, and I wanted to argue with him, wanted to defend Danielle, but the words would not come. He said he thought I should stop seeing her, cut contact completely before things escalated further. I told him he was overreacting, that he did not understand our history, that Danielle just needed support and patience. We went back and forth until he grabbed his keys and left, saying he could not watch me do this to myself. I sat alone in his apartment for a long time after he walked out, scrolling through the screenshots he had sent me, reading those posts over and over again. Christy. I wondered what had happened to her. I wondered if she had seen the warning signs too and ignored them, just like I was doing. The breaking point came on a Monday evening in late April. I had left work early because of a headache that had been building all day, a dull pressure behind my eyes that made it hard to focus on my computer screen. When I pulled into my parking spot at the apartment complex, I noticed the light was on in my living room window. I had not left any lights on that morning. I sat in my car for a few minutes, my keys gripped tight in my fist, watching the window. A shadow moved across the curtain. Someone was inside. I called the building manager first, a tired older man named Walt who lived in the basement unit. He answered on the third ring and told me he had not let anyone in today, that he had been out running errands most of the afternoon. I asked him about the time he let Danielle in before with the pillow and he went quiet. He said he never let anyone in, that no one had asked him to. My throat went dry. I called the police next and waited in my car until they arrived. 2 officers in a cruiser who walked up to my building with their hands resting on their belts. They went inside and came back out 10 minutes later. The apartment was empty, they said. No signs of forced entry. But they had found something on my bed. A stack of photographs, maybe 30 or 40 of them. All pictures of me. Me walking to my car. Me sitting at my desk through the office window. Me and Spencer at the Italian restaurant we liked on Franklin Street. Me sleeping in my own bed, taken through the gap in my bedroom curtains. The officers asked if I knew who might have done this, and I said the name out loud for the first time like it was a confession. Danielle Voss. I filed a police report that night and applied for a restraining order the next morning. The process was exhausting and invasive, requiring me to document everything. The texts, the lies about Diane, the car in the parking garage, the items moved in my apartment, every small violation I had brushed aside for weeks. Danielle did not make it easy. She showed up at my office 2 days later, crying in the lobby, telling Colleen that I had abandoned her, that she did not understand what she had done wrong. Security escorted her out while I watched from behind the glass door of the conference room, my whole body trembling. She sent me emails from new accounts after I blocked her number, long rambling messages about how we were meant to be in each other's lives, how no one else would ever understand me the way she did. The restraining order was granted after 3 weeks, and I moved to a new apartment on the other side of the city, a place with better locks and a security camera at the entrance. Spencer and I worked things out. Diane and I slowly rebuilt our friendship over coffee and apologies. I still check the locks twice before bed every night. I still look for silver Nissan cars in parking lots wherever I go. Danielle never contacted me again after the order was served, but sometimes I search her name online just to see where she is now. Last month I found a new social media profile she had created. Her most recent post was a photo of a woman I did not recognize, tagged as her best friend, with a caption that said, "So grateful to have found my person." I stared at that picture for a long time, at the woman's smiling face, and I wanted to warn her. I wanted to reach out and tell her everything, but I did not know how to explain it, how to make someone believe that the person standing next to them with that warm smile and those thoughtful gifts was already mapping out the walls of a cage. So I closed the browser and tried to forget, but I never really do. Anyone who graduated from Jefferson High in 2011 probably remembers Darren Foley. He was the guy who made everyone laugh during assemblies, the one who could talk his way out of detention and into any party worth attending. We played basketball together since middle school, shared our first beers behind his parents' garage, and swore we would be friends forever the way only teenage boys can. When he called me out of nowhere last March, saying he had hit rock bottom and needed a place to crash for a few weeks, I did not hesitate. My wife Lauren had concerns, but I told her this was Darren, my brother from another mother. I had a spare bedroom, a stable job as a project manager at a construction firm, and what I thought was an unbreakable bond forged over 15 years of friendship. Saying no never even crossed my mind. The first week went exactly how I expected. Darren showed up with a single duffel bag and the same crooked grin I remembered from high school. He was polite to Lauren, helped with dishes without being asked, and spent most of his time sending out job applications from my living room couch. We stayed up late a few nights, drinking beers and reminiscing about old times. Remember when we snuck into the Riverside pool after hours? Remember when Coach Patterson caught us skipping practice? It felt good having him around, like reconnecting with a part of myself I had forgotten existed. Lauren even admitted she had been wrong to worry. "He seems like a good guy," she said one night after Darren had gone to bed early. "Maybe this will work out fine." I remember smiling at her, feeling proud that I could help an old friend while proving that my judgment about people was sound. That pride would become the thing I regretted most. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that I almost missed it. By the second week, Darren stopped cleaning up after himself. Dishes piled in the sink, his dirty clothes appeared in random corners of the house, and the guest bathroom developed a smell that made Lauren gag every time she walked past. When I mentioned it casually, he laughed it off and said he would get to it later. later never came. Then the job applications stopped. I noticed because the laptop I had lent him sat untouched for days, the screen dark, while Darren spent hours scrolling through his phone on my couch. He started sleeping until noon, sometimes later, and would raid the fridge at 2 in the morning. I know because the noise woke me up more than once. Lauren stopped saying anything positive about him. She just gave me this look, the kind married people develop after years together. The one that says I told you so without using words. Week 3 brought the first real argument between Lauren and me. She wanted Darren out. I wanted to give him more time. He is going through something, I said. You do not just abandon people when they are struggling. She reminded me that we had agreed on 2 weeks maximum, that our savings were not infinite, that the grocery bills had nearly doubled since he arrived. I accused her of being heartless. She accused me of being blind. That night, Darren overheard us fighting through the walls. Our house was not big, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood outside of Nashville, and the next morning he apologized with tears in his eyes. He promised to do better, to find work within the week, to respect our space. I believed every word because I needed to believe it, because admitting I was wrong meant admitting that the Darren I knew in high school no longer existed, and I was not ready for that funeral. The promises lasted exactly 4 days. I came home from work on a Thursday evening to find 2 strangers sitting in my living room. They were both men, late 20s maybe, with the kind of hollow eyes that come from too many sleepless nights and bad decisions. One of them had a neck tattoo of a snake swallowing its own tail, and the other kept bouncing his knee in a way that made the whole couch vibrate. Darren introduced them as buddies from a job he had worked last year, said they were just hanging out for a bit. Nobody asked my permission. Nobody acknowledged that this was my house, my space, my furniture they were putting their feet on. Lauren was still at work. She had picked up extra shifts as a nurse at the county hospital, partly because we needed the money now, and I remember being grateful she was not there to see this. I asked Darren to speak with me in the kitchen, and he came along with this annoyed expression on his face, like I was being unreasonable. "These are my friends," he said. "What is the big deal?" I told him the big deal was that he could not just invite random people into my home without asking. He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged and said, "Fine, whatever. They will leave soon." They did not leave soon. Those 2 men stayed until past midnight, and when they finally walked out the front door, I noticed that a bottle of whiskey I kept in the cabinet, a gift from my father-in-law, a 20-year single malt I was saving for a special occasion, had been emptied and left on the coffee table. I did not mention it to Darren that night because I was too tired to fight, but something had changed in the air of my own home, a tension that had not been there before. Started locking my bedroom door at night, something I had never done in 6 years of living there. Lauren noticed and asked why. I lied and said I had read an article about home security, that it was just a precaution. She knew I was lying. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the way her jaw tightened when Darren walked into the room the next morning. We were both holding our breath now, waiting for something we could not name, and the walls of our little house seemed to shrink a bit more every day. Darren started testing boundaries in ways that felt deliberate. He would walk into our bedroom without knocking, claiming he needed to borrow a phone charger or ask a quick question. He began making comments about Lauren when she was not around. Nothing overtly threatening, just observations that left a sour taste in my mouth. "She looks stressed lately," he would say. "She should smile more." Or he would mention how nice she looked in a particular dress, then hold eye contact with me a beat too long, like he was waiting to see if I would react. One evening I found him standing in the hallway outside our bathroom while Lauren was showering. He said he was waiting to use it, but the guest bathroom was empty, and he knew that. When I confronted him, he laughed and called me paranoid. "You are acting crazy, man," he said. "I have known you since we were 12. You think I would do something to your wife?" He made me feel like the problem, like my instincts were betraying me. That is what people like Darren do. They twist reality until you cannot trust your own perception anymore. Lauren gave me an ultimatum on a Sunday morning in early April. "Either he goes or I go," she said, and I could see she had been crying before I woke up. She told me things I had not noticed or had chosen to ignore. How Darren had made comments to her directly when I was not home. How he had stood too close in the kitchen once, blocking her path to the door, and only moved when she raised her voice. How she no longer felt safe in her own house. I wanted to defend myself, to say I did not know. But the truth was uglier than that. I had suspected something was wrong and done nothing because confronting it meant confronting my own failure. That afternoon, Lauren packed a bag and drove to her sister's place in Memphis. She said she would come back when Darren was gone, not before. I stood in the driveway and watched her car disappear around the corner, and the silence she left behind was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I went back inside with every intention of telling Darren to leave. The words were rehearsed in my head, firm and final. "This is not working out. You need to find somewhere else to stay. I am sorry, but you have to go today." But when I walked into the living room, he was not alone. The two men from before were back, plus a woman I had never seen, skinny with dark circles under her eyes and fingernails bitten down to raw pink. They were drinking my beer, watching my television, and Darren sat in the middle of them like a king on a borrowed throne. He looked up at me and smiled, not the crooked grin from high school, but something harder, something that had no warmth behind it. "I heard Lauren left," he said. "That is too bad." She seemed nice. The way he said it made my stomach turn. I told him we needed to talk in private, and he waved his hand dismissively. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of my friends. They are practically family at this point." The woman laughed at that, a high-pitched sound that bounced off the walls. I said it anyway, right there in front of all of them. I told Darren he had to leave, that I wanted everyone out of my house by the end of the day. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Darren stood up slowly, and I noticed for the first time how much bigger he had gotten since high school. Not fat, but thick, solid in a way that made me aware of my own average build. He walked toward me until we were standing close enough that I could smell cigarettes on his breath, a habit he must have picked up recently because he never smoked when we were younger. "You are kicking me out," he said, more a statement than a question, "after everything I have done for you." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was nothing there I recognized. No friendship, no gratitude, no memory of shared history. Just cold calculation and something that looked a lot like contempt. He shoved me then, both hands flat against my chest, hard enough to send me stumbling backward into the wall. The back of my head hit the corner of a picture frame, and I felt a sharp sting followed by something warm trickling down my neck. The next few minutes became a blur of noise and movement. One of the men grabbed my arm while the other blocked the front door. Darren stood in front of me, breathing hard, his face red with an anger I did not understand and had done nothing to deserve. "You think you can just throw me out like garbage," he said, "after I lost everything. After my own family turned their backs on me. You were supposed to be different." He hit me then, a closed fist to the side of my face that sent white sparks across my vision. I tasted copper and felt one of my teeth shift in a way teeth should not move. The woman on the couch had not moved at all. She just watched with empty eyes, like this was something she had seen before and would see again. I managed to break free from the man holding my arm, and pure survival instinct sent me running toward the back of the house. I made it to the kitchen, grabbed my car keys from the counter where I always left them, and went through the garage door. I heard Darren yelling behind me, heard footsteps on the concrete, but I was already in my truck and reversing down the driveway before anyone could reach me. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was Darren standing at the edge of my property, arms at his sides, watching me flee from my own home. I drove straight to the police station with blood drying on my collar and a bruise already swelling beneath my left eye. The officers took my statement and photographs of my injuries, and two of them accompanied me back to the house an hour later. Darren and his friends were gone by then, but so were a lot of other things. My laptop, Lauren's jewelry box, the emergency cash we kept in the bedroom closet, even the television. The place looked like it had been ransacked by strangers, which I suppose it had been. I filed a report, changed all the locks, and spent that night at a motel because I could not stand to sleep in those rooms alone. Lauren came back 3 days later, and we held each other in the empty living room without saying much. The police eventually found Darren 2 weeks after that, picked him up on unrelated charges in a town about 40 miles south. I never saw him face to face again, never got most of our things back, never received an apology or explanation. What I got instead was a restraining order and a hard lesson about the distance between who people were and who they become. Sometimes I still think about that kid from Jefferson High, the one who made everyone laugh, and I wonder where exactly he disappeared to. But then, I touch the small scar on the back of my head, and I remember that wondering is a luxury I can no longer afford. My friend Danielle texted me out of nowhere in March of 2023, after almost 6 years of radio silence. We had been close in college, the kind of friendship where you spend every weekend together and swear you will be bridesmaids at each other's weddings. But life happened. People drift, and by the time my 20s were behind me, Danielle had become just another name I sometimes thought about when old photos popped up on my phone. So when she reached out saying she had rented a farmhouse in rural Tennessee for a weekend getaway and wanted to reconnect, I felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement. She mentioned she had gone through some rough years and was finally in a good place, that she missed the old days and wanted to gather a few of us together. I said yes almost immediately, thinking it would be nice to see her again, maybe make up for lost time. Looking at it now, I realize how desperate the whole thing sounded, but back then I just saw an old friend reaching out. The drive from Nashville took about 2.5 hours, mostly on smaller roads that got progressively emptier the further I went. Danielle had sent me the address and told me to ignore my GPS for the last stretch because it would try to take me through a flooded road. I followed her directions instead, turning onto a gravel path that cut through dense woods and overgrown fields. The house appeared suddenly after a bend, a 2-story wooden structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle. There were no other cars in the driveway. I checked my phone and saw it was almost 4 in the afternoon, so I figured maybe I was the first one to arrive. I grabbed my overnight bag and walked up the creaking steps, noticing how quiet everything was out here. Not even birds or insects making noise. Danielle opened the door before I could knock, and she looked different from how I remembered her. Thinner, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that seemed like it had not been washed in days. She hugged me tight, maybe a little too tight, and said she was so glad I came. I asked her where everyone else was, and she waved her hand dismissively and said they were running late, that Courtney had texted saying she would be there around 7 and Bree was coming from Memphis, so probably even later. I did not know a Courtney or a Bri, but I assumed these were friends she had made after we lost touch. The inside of the house smelled like dust and something faintly chemical, like cleaning products that had been sprayed too recently. Danielle gave me a quick tour, showing me the kitchen with its outdated appliances and the living room with mismatched furniture that looked like it came from different decades. She pointed upstairs and said my room was the second door on the left, that I should get settled and come back down for wine. I remember thinking the place had a weird energy, not in a supernatural way, just in the way that abandoned spaces feel when someone tries to make them livable again too quickly. I went upstairs and found the bedroom, a small space with a single bed pushed against the wall, and curtains that blocked most of the natural light. My phone had 1 bar of signal, sometimes 2 if I stood near the window. I texted my sister to let her know I had arrived safely, and she responded with a thumbs-up emoji before the message took almost a full minute to send. When I came back downstairs, Danielle had already poured 2 glasses of red wine and was sitting on the couch with her legs tucked under her. She patted the cushion next to her and started talking about how much she had missed me, how the years after college had been hard for her in ways she could not fully explain. I listened and nodded, feeling bad that I had not reached out sooner. She asked me about my life, my job, whether I was seeing anyone, and I gave her the basics without going into too much detail. The whole time she kept refilling my glass, and I noticed she was barely touching hers. Around 6:30, I asked if she had heard from the other girls, And Danielle checked her phone with a frown before saying Courtney had just canceled. Something about her kid getting sick. She said Bree had not responded to her last message. I felt a small knot forming in my chest. Not panic exactly, but discomfort at the idea of spending the whole weekend alone with someone I barely knew anymore. I suggested maybe we could reschedule, do this another time when everyone could make it, and Danielle's face changed in a way that is hard to describe. It was like watching a mask slip for half a second before she caught herself and smiled again. She said no, that was silly. We were already here and it would be fun, just the two of us like old times. She reached over and squeezed my hand, her fingers cold and dry, and told me she had been looking forward to this for so long. The way she said it made me feel like I owed her something, like leaving would be a betrayal. So I stayed, and I poured myself another glass of wine because I did not know what else to do. By 8, the sun had gone down completely, and the house felt smaller somehow. The shadows in the corners deeper, and the silence outside more oppressive. Danielle had made pasta for dinner, a simple dish with garlic and olive oil, and we ate at a small table in the kitchen while she talked about people from college I had almost forgotten existed. Then she brought up Nathan, and everything shifted. Nathan had been her boyfriend during junior year, a guy she was completely obsessed with until he broke up with her right before finals. I remembered it vaguely because she had been devastated, crying for weeks and barely leaving her dorm room. What I did not remember, and what Danielle now told me with a flat voice and unblinking eyes, was that I had apparently been the reason they broke up. She said Nathan had told her he had feelings for me, that he wanted to be with me instead, and that I had known about it and never said anything. I started to tell her that was not true, that I had no idea what she was talking about. But she cut me off and said she did not want to hear excuses, not tonight. I tried to stay calm because I genuinely believed this was some kind of misunderstanding that we could talk through like adults. I told her I never had any romantic contact with Nathan, that I barely even spoke to him outside of group hangouts, and that if he said something to her about me, it was news to me. Danielle just stared at me with this expression that was almost amused, like I was a child telling an obvious lie. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of old messages, conversations between her and Nathan from 2014, where he mentioned my name multiple times, saying things like how pretty I was and how he wished he had met me first. Reading those messages made me feel sick, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I realized Danielle had been holding on to this for almost a decade. She had saved these screenshots, carried them with her through the years, let them fester inside her head until they became something monstrous. I handed the phone back and told her I was sorry Nathan said those things, but I had no control over his feelings, and I never encouraged them. She took the phone and set it face down on the table, then asked me why I thought she had invited me here. The question hung in the air, and I did not answer because suddenly I was scared to. I looked toward the front door, calculating the distance and wondering where my car keys were. Danielle noticed and let out a small laugh, the kind that had no warmth in it at all. She said my keys were in her purse, that she had taken them when I went upstairs to settle in, just as a precaution. My heart started beating faster and I stood up from the table, trying to keep my voice steady, as I told her this was not okay, that I wanted to leave right now. She stayed seated, completely relaxed, and said the nearest town was about 15 miles away, and there were no streetlights on that road, so walking was not really an option. She said I should sit back down and finish my wine, that we still had a lot to talk about. I thought about running anyway, grabbing my bag and just going, but it was pitch black outside and I had no idea where I was. I also thought about calling someone, but my phone was upstairs and the signal was barely functional. So I sat back down, my pulse pounding in my ears, and waited to see what she would do next. Danielle started talking again, but her voice had changed, slower and more deliberate, like she had rehearsed this speech many times before. She told me that after Nathan broke up with her, she spiraled into a depression that lasted years. She dropped out of school, moved back in with her parents, and spent most of her mid-20s going through different medications and therapists trying to feel normal again. She said she lost friends, jobs, relationships, all because she could never get over what happened. And the whole time she kept tabs on me through social media, watching me graduate, get a job, go on vacations, smile in photos with people who loved me. She said it was like watching someone live the life that was stolen from her. I wanted to tell her that none of that was my fault, that I had my own struggles she never saw, but I knew it would not matter. In her mind, I was the villain of her story, and nothing I said was going to change that. She had built an entire narrative around me being the reason her life fell apart, and this weekend was supposed to be some kind of reckoning. She stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, opening a drawer and pulling out a small notebook with a worn cover. She brought it back to the table and flipped through the pages, showing me entries dated over several years, all of them about me. Some were just observations, things I had posted online or updates about my life she had gathered from mutual acquaintances. Others were more disturbing, long paragraphs about how I had ruined her chance at happiness, and how she fantasized about making me understand her pain. There were pages where she had written my name over and over, surrounded by words like liar and thief and someday. I felt my whole body go cold reading those pages, realizing that this was not a spontaneous breakdown or a momentary lapse in judgment. Danielle had been planning something for years, keeping this journal like a countdown to a moment she had been waiting for. I asked her what she wanted from me, what would make this stop, and she closed the notebook and looked at me with something close to pity. She said she just wanted me to stay and listen, that was all. Just stay and listen until she was finished. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Danielle talked and talked, going through every grievance she had collected over the years, every perceived slight and injustice she blamed me for. She brought up things I had completely forgotten, a comment I made at a party in 2013, a photo I was tagged in with Nathan in the background, a birthday message I sent her that she thought was insincere. She dissected each one like evidence in a trial, explaining how they proved I was a manipulative person who had sabotaged her on purpose. I sat there and listened because I did not know what else to do, nodding when she seemed to want acknowledgement, and staying quiet when her voice got louder. At some point around midnight, she started crying, these deep sobs that shook her whole body, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Then she wiped her face and looked at me with red eyes and said this was good, that she felt lighter already, that she had needed to say all of this to my face for so long. She thanked me for coming, like I had done her a favor, like this was a normal interaction between two old friends catching up. Around 2 in the morning, she said she was tired and wanted to go to bed. She told me I could sleep in the room upstairs, that we would talk more in the morning, and then she walked to her bedroom and closed the door. I heard a lock click from the inside. I sat on that couch for maybe 20 minutes, not moving, just trying to process what had happened. Then I went to her purse as quietly as I could and found my keys exactly where she said they would be. I grabbed my bag from upstairs, skipping every step that had creaked earlier, and I left through the back door in the kitchen because I was afraid the front door would make too much noise. I ran to my car in the dark, got in and drove away without turning on my headlights until I reached the main road. I did not stop until I hit a gas station about 40 minutes later, and that is when I finally let myself break down. I never heard from Danielle again after that night. I blocked her on everything, changed my phone number, and told a few close friends what happened in case she ever tried to contact them. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed until morning, what the next part of her plan was. I try not to think about it too much, but every now and then I wake up at 2 in the morning and remember the sound of that lock clicking shut, and I cannot fall back asleep. After my 10-year high school reunion got canceled in 2018, I decided to reach out to some people I had lost touch with. I was working as an electrician in Knoxville, Tennessee, living in a small apartment near the river, spending most of my free time either fishing or playing video games alone. My graduating class had scattered across the country, and social media made it easy to see who got married, who had kids, who was doing well. But there was one name I kept searching for that never showed up anywhere. Colton Price. We had been inseparable from 7th grade through graduation, the kind of friendship where you finish each other's sentences and share secrets you would never tell anyone else. He was the best man at my wedding, even though that marriage only lasted 2 years. Then sometime around 2014, Colton fell into something bad. Prescription pills at first, then harder stuff. I tried to help. His family tried to help, but he pushed everyone away. One day, he just vanished. No phone, no address, no trace. His mom told me she had given up hope of ever seeing him again. So when I got a message from an account with his name on it in late September, I stared at my phone for a solid 5 minutes before responding. The profile picture was blank, just a gray silhouette, and the message itself was strange. It said, "Hey brother, I'm back. Would love to catch up if you're open to it. I'm in a much better place now." No explanation of where he had been for 4 years, no apology for disappearing, nothing about what happened, just those 3 short sentences. I typed back immediately, my heart pounding in my chest, asking if it was really him and where he had been. His response came almost an hour later, and it was just as minimal. "It's me. Can we meet? I have so much to share with you." Something about the phrasing struck me as odd, like it was written by someone who had learned English as a second language. But I chalked it up to my own paranoia. This was Colton, my best friend. Of course I wanted to see him. We agreed to meet at a diner off Chapman Highway, a place we used to go after football games back in high school. I got there early, grabbed a booth by the window and ordered coffee I did not really want, just to have something to do with my hands. The waitress was an older woman with a name tag that said Doris, and she kept refilling my cup without asking, which I appreciated because it gave me an excuse to keep looking at the door. Colton walked in exactly at 7, not a minute early or late, which was strange because the Colton I knew had never been on time for anything in his life. He used to joke that he would probably be late to his own funeral. But there he was, standing in the doorway, scanning the room with this slow mechanical movement of his head, like a security camera panning across a parking lot. When his eyes found me, he smiled, but it was not the smile I remembered. It was too wide, too symmetrical, like someone had taught him how to arrange his face into that expression, and he was following the instructions precisely. He slid into the booth across from me, and the first thing I noticed was how clean he looked. Not just sober, but scrubbed, polished, like he had been pressure washed and reassembled. His hair was cut short and neat, his skin was clear, his clothes were plain but spotless, a white button-down shirt tucked into khaki pants. He looked like someone going to a job interview at a bank. The Colton I remembered wore band t-shirts with holes in them and had a tattoo of a snake wrapped around his forearm that he got when we were 19. The tattoo was still there. I could see the tail of it peeking out from under his sleeve, but everything else about him seemed like a different person. He reached across the table and grabbed my hand, squeezing it hard, and said, "It is so good to see you, brother." His voice was flat, monotone, like he was reading from a script. I asked him where he had been, what happened, if he was okay. He just kept smiling that strange, wide smile and said, "I found something that saved my life. I want to share it with you." I tried to get him to explain what he meant, but every time I asked a direct question, he would deflect with these vague phrases that sounded rehearsed. The path revealed itself to me. I was lost, but now I am found. Everything happens according to the design. It was like talking to a customer service recording, pleasant and empty. When I asked about specific things like where he was living or what he did for work, he would pause for exactly 2 seconds before answering. I started counting after a while because it was so consistent. 2 seconds of silence, then an answer that never quite matched the question. He said he lived with his family now, but when I asked if he meant his parents, he shook his head slowly and said, "My real family. The ones who understand." His eyes never left my face while he talked, and I realized at some point that he had not blinked once since sitting down. I told myself I was imagining it, but I started watching for it, and I swear, he went a full 15 minutes without blinking. It made my own eyes water just looking at him. The strangest part was when Doris came over to take our order. Colton had not looked at the menu once, and when she asked what he wanted, he just stared at her for a long moment without responding. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable, and asked again if he needed a minute. He turned to me and said, "Order for me, brother. You know what I like." But I did not know what he liked anymore. The Colton I knew would have ordered a bacon cheeseburger with extra pickles and a chocolate milkshake. Same thing every time. I ordered that for him, and when the food came, he did not touch it. He just sat there with his hands folded on the table, watching me eat my own meal with that unblinking stare. I asked if something was wrong with the food, and he said, "I do not need to eat right now. I am sustained." I laughed because I thought he was joking, making fun of some health trend or fad diet, but his expression did not change at all. He was completely serious. I pushed my plate away, my appetite suddenly gone, and asked him point blank what was going on with him. That was when his face changed for the first time. The smile disappeared, and something harder took its place. A tightness around his jaw that I recognized from years ago, from the few times I had seen him truly angry. He leaned forward across the table, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You are asking the wrong questions. You are looking at the surface when you should be looking beneath." I told him I did not understand what he meant, and he grabbed my wrist hard enough that I felt the bones grind together. His grip was incredibly strong, way stronger than I remembered, and his fingers were cold even though the diner was warm. "They told me you would resist at first. They said you were not ready. But I know you, brother. I know the emptiness you carry. I know the hole inside you that nothing can fill. We can fill it. We can make you whole." I pulled my arm back and he let go, but he kept staring at me with this intensity that made me want to look away. I asked who they were. He smiled again, but this time it was different, smaller, almost secretive. "Soon," he said. "When you are ready, I will take you to meet them." I should have walked away right then. I should have thrown some cash on the table, told him to get help, and never looked back. But this was Colton, my best friend since we were 12 years old. The guy who held my hand at my dad's funeral when I was 17, who let me sleep on his couch for 3 weeks after my divorce, who knew things about me that I had never told another living soul. I could not just abandon him, not when he was clearly mixed up in something bad. So I agreed to meet him again, thinking maybe I could figure out what was happening. Maybe I could help him the way I failed to help him when the drugs took over. We set a time for the following Saturday, same place, and he stood up from the booth without another word. He walked out of the diner and I watched him through the window, expecting him to get into a car or walk toward the bus stop. Instead, he just stood on the sidewalk, perfectly still, facing away from me. A white van pulled up about a minute later, unmarked, no windows in the back. The side door slid open and Colton climbed in without hesitation, like he had done it 1,000 times before. The van drove away and I sat there in that booth for another hour, trying to convince myself that what I had just witnessed was normal. The week between our meetings was one of the longest of my life. I could not stop thinking about Colton, about the way he talked, the way he moved, the emptiness behind his eyes. I started researching online, typing things like "friend joined a cult" and signs of brainwashing into search engines at 2 in the morning when I could not sleep. The articles I found described exactly what I had seen. The rehearsed phrases, the emotional flatness, the use versus them mentality, the mysterious family that replaced all previous relationships. Some of these groups targeted addicts specifically, people who were already broken and desperate, people who would do anything to escape the pain they were in. They offered structure, purpose, belonging. They offered to fill the hole. And once they had you, they did not let go. I thought about calling his mom, warning her that he was back but that something was seriously wrong, but I did not know what I would even say. "Your son is alive, but he talks like a robot and got picked up by a windowless van." She would think I was crazy. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe Colton had just found religion or gotten really into meditation or something, and I was making it into something sinister because I felt guilty for not saving him from the drugs. Saturday came and I drove back to the diner, my stomach churning the whole way. Colton was already there when I arrived, sitting in the same booth, wearing the exact same clothes as before, the white button-down and khaki pants. I wondered if he owned anything else, or if this was some kind of uniform. He smiled when he saw me, that wide mechanical smile, and gestured for me to sit down. This time he had brought something with him, a small leather-bound book that he placed on the table between us. The cover was blank, no title or author, just worn brown leather that looked like it had been handled by many hands over many years. He pushed it toward me and said, "This will help you understand. This is how it began for me." I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The text inside was handwritten, dense paragraphs in tiny, careful script, but the words did not make sense. They were English words arranged in patterns that almost formed sentences but kept sliding away from meaning, like trying to read in a dream. There were diagrams too, circles within circles, arrows pointing inward, stick figures arranged in geometric formations. I asked Colton what this was supposed to be. He reached across the table and closed the book gently, his hand resting on mine. "You are not ready to read it yet. You need to hear it first. You need to hear him speak." I asked who him was, and Colton's eyes lit up in a way I had not seen since we were teenagers, this sudden spark of genuine emotion breaking through the flatness. "The guide," he said, and the way he pronounced those two words made them sound capitalized, sacred. "He found me when I was dying. I was living under a bridge in Nashville, shooting anything I could get my hands into my veins, waiting for my heart to finally give out. And he came to me. He sat with me in the dirt and the filth, and he told me that my suffering had a purpose, that I had been broken so I could be rebuilt, that everything I had lost was just preparation for what I would gain." Colton's voice had changed while he spoke, becoming more animated, more like the person I remembered. But there was something underneath it that scared me, a fervor that reminded me of the old street preachers who used to stand on corners downtown screaming about the end of the world. I asked what this guide wanted from him. Colton tilted his head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound. "He does not want anything from me. He gives. He only gives. He gave me clarity, purpose, family, and now he wants me to give those things to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There is a gathering tomorrow night. Come with me. Just listen. If you do not feel anything, I will never ask you again." I took the paper without thinking, some automatic reflex from years of accepting things that Colton handed me. It was an address, handwritten in the same careful script as the book, somewhere out in Sevier County near the foothills of the Smokies. Below the address was a time, 9 at night, and below that a single sentence: "Come with an empty vessel and leave with purpose." I looked up at Colton and saw something I had not noticed before, a small scar on the side of his neck, right below his ear. It was pale and perfectly circular, about the size of a cigarette burn, and when I looked closer I could see that it was not alone. There were more of them, a line of identical circles disappearing under his collar, evenly spaced like buttons. I asked him what happened to his neck, and the spark in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by that flat, empty stare. "Proof of commitment," he said. "Proof that the body is just a container." He stood up from the booth, tucking the leather book back into his jacket. "Tomorrow night, I will be waiting outside at 9. Do not be late, brother." He walked out of the diner and I watched him climb into the same white van that had been idling in the parking lot the entire time we talked, its engine running, someone behind the tinted windshield I could not see. I did not go to the gathering. I sat in my apartment that Sunday night with all the lights on, staring at the folded piece of paper on my kitchen table, watching the clock tick past 9. Part of me wanted to go, wanted to understand what had happened to my friend, wanted to believe that maybe I could pull him out of whatever this was. But a bigger part of me knew that was exactly what they were counting on. That was how it worked. They send someone you love, someone you trust, someone you would follow anywhere, and they use that connection to reel you in. I thought about Colton sitting in that parking lot, waiting for me in the van, watching the road for my headlights. I thought about him going back inside and telling them that I did not show up, that I was not ready yet, that they needed to try a different approach. Around midnight, I got a text from his number, just 3 words. "You will come." Not a question, not even really a statement, a certainty. I blocked the number and sat there in the dark for a long time, thinking about all the ways I had failed him over the years, all the moments I could have done something differently, all the choices that led us both to this point. The next morning, I called his mother. I told her everything, the meetings, the van, the scars, the book, the gathering I did not attend. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. She said she had gotten a letter from Colton about a month before he contacted me, handwritten, telling her that he was alive and well, and that he had found his true family. She said the handwriting was his, but the words were not, like someone had dictated exactly what to say. She had hired a private investigator, spent thousands of dollars she did not have, but they could not find anything. No address, no employment records, no trace of where he was living or who he was with. The investigator told her that groups like this were careful, that they moved around, that they kept their members isolated and dependent. He said the best thing she could do was wait and hope that someday Colton would find his way back on his own. I gave her the address from the piece of paper, even though I knew it was probably useless. Probably just a temporary location they had already abandoned. She thanked me and hung up, and I never heard from her again. It has been 6 years since those meetings at the diner. I moved to a different city, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts. Not because I was afraid of Colton finding me, though maybe I was a little, but because I could not stand the idea of getting another message like that first one. Another gray silhouette profile picture asking me to catch up. I think about him sometimes, especially late at night when sleep will not come. I wonder if he is still out there somewhere, still wearing that white button-down shirt, still waiting in parking lots for people who used to love him. I wonder if he ever thinks about who he was before, if there is any part of the real Colton left underneath all those layers of whatever they put into his head. A few months ago, I saw a news story about a compound in rural Georgia that got raided by federal agents, some kind of labor trafficking operation disguised as a religious community. The footage showed people in identical white shirts being led out in handcuffs, their faces blank and confused, like they had just woken up from a long, dreamless sleep. I paused the video and studied every face, looking for one I recognized. Colton was not there. Part of me was relieved. Part of me wished he had been, because at least then I would know where he was. At least then there would be a chance someone could help him. But mostly I just felt tired, this deep exhaustion that has never really gone away. I lost my best friend twice, first to the drugs and then to something worse. And the hardest part, the thing that keeps me up at night, is knowing that he is still out there somewhere, still breathing, still walking around with my phone number memorized in his head, and that someday, maybe tomorrow, or maybe 10 years from now, I might get another message asking me to come back, asking me to listen, telling me that I will come, and I do not know if I will be strong enough to say no again. Around my 10-year high school reunion, I got a Facebook message from Brandon Kelly. We had been decent friends back in the day, sat next to each other in chemistry, played on the same basketball team sophomore year. After graduation, he went down a rough path, got into drugs, did some time for possession, the whole thing. His name would come up occasionally when old classmates gossiped about who made it and who didn't. So when I saw his message pop up, I almost ignored it. But something made me click. He told me he had gotten clean, found Jesus, started his own little business. The profile picture showed a different person than I remembered. Healthier, smiling, standing next to a modest sedan like he was proud of it. I figured everyone deserves a second chance. We agreed to grab coffee that Saturday, catch up like normal people do. I had no idea that one decision would cost me everything I spent years building. We met at a diner off Route 9, one of those places with sticky menus and bottomless coffee. Brandon looked good, genuinely good. He had put on some healthy weight, his eyes were clear, and he talked about his daughter like she was the center of his universe. He showed me pictures on his phone. A little girl named Kaylee, maybe 4 years old, with his exact same smile. For the first hour, we just talked about life. I told him about my job doing IT support for a medical billing company. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the mortgage. He listened, nodded, asked real questions. Then he started telling me about this side hustle he had going. Said he was buying stuff online, electronics, brand name clothes, household items, and flipping them for profit on different platforms. Nothing crazy, just arbitrage. He made it sound like everyone was doing it, like it was just being smart with money. He asked if I wanted in on it, said he could show me the ropes. The extra cash would help, he said, and my car needed new brakes and my credit card balance was getting out of control. I said I would think about it. By the end of that week, I had already joined the private Discord server he sent me. The Discord had maybe 40 people in it, all using usernames instead of real names. Brandon was FlipKing499, and he told me to pick something generic, so I went with Midwest Grind. The setup seemed legit at first. People would post deals they found, a pallet of returned merchandise from a big retailer going for pennies on the dollar, limited edition sneakers dropping at specific times, electronics with pricing errors that you could snag before the company fixed it. The idea was simple: buy low, sell high, repeat. Brandon walked me through my first flip in a private voice chat. We bought a batch of Bluetooth speakers from a liquidation site for about $80 total, then listed them individually on 3 different marketplaces. Within 2 weeks, I made almost $300 profit. It felt like free money. I remember telling my wife Amy about it, showing her the PayPal balance on my phone. She was skeptical but happy. We used that first profit to finally fix the brakes on my car. That felt like proof that this whole thing was real, that Brandon had actually figured something out. For the next couple months, everything ran smooth. I was making an extra $500, sometimes $800 a month just working a few hours after my regular job. The Discord group had rules. No talking about the server outside of it, no screenshots, no inviting anyone without approval from the admins. Brandon said it was just to protect the deals, keep the competition low. Made sense to me. I got to know some of the regulars through text chat. There was a guy called Texas Toast who claimed to be a former accountant, and a woman named Sparkle Mom who said she was a single mother of 3 just trying to make ends meet. We shared tips, celebrated wins, complained about shipping costs. It felt like a little community. Brandon and I started talking almost every day, sometimes about business, sometimes just life stuff. He told me about his struggles with sobriety, how his ex barely let him see Kaylee, how this reselling thing had given him purpose. I believed every word. I wanted to believe it. Because if Brandon could turn his life around like that, maybe there was hope for anyone. Maybe I was helping him stay on the right path just by being his friend again. Things started shifting around month 4. Brandon messaged me late one night, said he had access to something bigger. A contact who worked at a distribution center was willing to sell inventory lists before they went public. Not the products themselves, just information about what was coming, when, and at what price points. Brandon said it was like insider trading but for retail goods. He laughed when he typed it, added a bunch of crying, laughing emojis. I asked if it was legal and he said it was a gray area, that corporations did way worse every single day. The first time we used the list, we made over $2,000 in a single weekend. I deposited the money into a separate checking account I had opened just for the side business. Amy noticed I was spending more time on my laptop at night, but I told her work was busy. That was my first real lie to her about any of this. It sat in my stomach like a rock, but then I looked at the account balance and convinced myself it was worth it. We were saving for a house. This was going to get us there faster. The gray areas kept getting darker. By month 6, Brandon introduced me to a method he called return cycling. The concept was simple but ugly. You buy an expensive item with a credit card, swap it with a cheaper knockoff or broken unit, then return the fake as if it was the original, and get your money back while keeping the real product to sell. Brandon assured me the big box stores wrote off this kind of loss as routine shrinkage, that nobody got hurt because they were insured for it. I told him I was not comfortable doing that myself. He said fine, no pressure, but he needed someone to help him list the items online since he was getting overwhelmed. So, I became his seller. I would receive packages at my house, photograph the products, write the descriptions, handle the shipping. I told myself I was just doing logistics. I was not the one committing the fraud. But deep down, I knew that was a lie too. Every time I printed a shipping label, I felt this tightness in my chest that would not go away. I started having trouble sleeping. Amy asked me if something was wrong and I snapped at her. Told her to stop asking questions. That was the moment I should have walked away. I still think about that almost every day. Around month 8, the Discord server started getting paranoid. One of the regulars, a guy who went by Ohio Hustle, stopped posting out of nowhere. A few days later, someone said they heard he got a visit from postal inspectors asking about packages. Brandon told everyone to stay calm, said Ohio Hustle was probably sloppy with his methods, and that the rest of us were fine as long as we followed protocol. But the vibe in the group changed after that. People started deleting old messages, changing their usernames, talking about VPNs and encrypted apps. Brandon moved our private conversations to Signal and told me to delete our entire text history. I did it without questioning him. Looking back, that blind obedience terrifies me more than anything else. I had become so deep in this thing that I just did whatever he said. He could have told me to drive a package across state lines, and I probably would have done it. That is not who I was before any of this. I was the guy who returned extra change when a cashier made a mistake. I was the guy who reminded coworkers to log their overtime so they would get paid correctly. Somewhere along the way, Brandon had turned me into someone I did not recognize. Then came the day everything collapsed. It was a Thursday morning in late spring, one of those perfect days where the sun is warm, but there is still a cool breeze. I was working from home, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when I heard a hard knock at the front door. Not a normal knock, the kind that sounds like authority. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 people in plain clothes holding badges. My legs went weak and I had to grab the wall to keep myself upright. They identified themselves as investigators with the Postal Service and asked if I was willing to answer some questions. I let them in because I thought refusing would make me look guilty. They sat on my couch, the same couch where Amy and I watched movies on weekends, and they started asking me about packages, specific tracking numbers, specific dates. They had a folder with printouts of listings that I had created, screenshots of product descriptions I had written with my own hands. One of them asked me how I knew Brandon Kelly. I said he was an old friend from high school. The other one nodded slowly and wrote something down in a small notebook. They asked if I would be willing to come down to their office for a more formal interview. I said I needed to talk to a lawyer first. They left me a business card and walked out. The whole conversation lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The second they drove away, I grabbed my phone and called Brandon. Straight to voicemail. I texted him on Signal. Nothing. I checked the Discord server and got an error message saying the server no longer existed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried his regular number, his Facebook, even his email. Everything was dead or unanswered. I drove to the last address I had for him, an apartment complex on the east side of town, and the landlord told me he had moved out 3 days earlier. Paid his last month in cash, did not leave a forwarding address. 3 days. That meant Brandon knew something was coming before the investigators even showed up at my door. He had planned this. He had time to disappear while I was still sitting at home thinking everything was fine. I sat in my car in that apartment parking lot for almost an hour, just staring at the building, trying to understand how someone I trusted could do this. We had talked almost every day for nearly a year. He told me about his daughter, his recovery, his dreams. Was any of it real? Or was I just a useful idiot from the very beginning? Someone with a clean record and a stable address who could be the face of his operation while he stayed in the shadows? That night, I finally told Amy everything. We sat at the kitchen table and I laid it all out. The discord, the flips, the return fraud, the investigators. She did not yell or cry. She just looked at me with this expression I had never seen before, like she was looking at a stranger. After I finished talking, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me one question. Why did I not tell her sooner? I did not have a good answer. I said I thought I was protecting her, that I did not want her to worry. But the truth was, I was ashamed. I knew what I was doing was wrong and I did not want to see that judgment in her eyes. She slept in the guest room that night. I stayed up until 4 a.m. going through every email, every file, every transaction, trying to piece together just how exposed I really was. The answer was bad. My name was on shipping labels, on marketplace accounts, on the checking account where all the money flowed through. Brandon had been careful to keep himself one step removed from everything. The packages came to my house. The accounts were registered with my information. If anyone was going to take the fall for this, it was me. I hired a lawyer the next day, a woman named Christine who specialized in federal cases. She was not cheap, but she was direct, which I appreciated. After reviewing everything I had, she told me the situation was serious but not hopeless. The investigators were building a case against a network, not just me. If I cooperated fully and could demonstrate that Brandon was the one running the operation, there was a chance I could avoid the worst outcomes. She used words like accessory and conspiracy and plea negotiation, and each one landed like a punch to the gut. I spent the next 3 months living in a constant state of anxiety. Every time the phone rang, I thought it was the investigators calling to arrest me. Every time a car slowed down near my house, I thought they were coming to take me away. I lost 15 pounds because I could barely eat. Amy and I started couples counseling, but something between us had broken. She looked at me differently now, like she was always waiting for the next lie. I do not blame her. I had become someone who could look her in the eyes and hide an entire secret life. The man she married would never have done that, but I did, and no amount of apologizing could undo it. It has been almost 2 years since that Thursday morning when the investigators knocked on my door. I ended up taking a deal: probation, a fine community service, and a felony on my record that will follow me for the rest of my life. I lost my job when the background check flagged my case during a routine audit. Amy and I are still together, but we are not the same. Some days are better than others. Brandon was never found, at least not that I know of. Christine told me the investigators believed he had done this before in other states, using other people like me. A pattern of finding someone vulnerable, building trust, then disappearing when the heat came. I think about him sometimes, wonder where he is, if he is running the same scheme on some other desperate person right now. But mostly I think about myself, about how easily I let it happen. I wanted to believe people could change. I wanted to believe that extra money would solve my problems. I wanted to believe I was just helping a friend, and that wanting, that desperate need to believe in something good, is exactly what he used against me. Trust is supposed to be a gift you give to people who earn it. I learned the hard way that some people see it as nothing more than a door you leave unlocked. Sometimes your past finds you in the most ordinary places. Mine found me at the frozen foods section of a grocery store in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on a Wednesday afternoon in late September 2024. I had just turned 34 the month before. My daughter Molly had made me a lopsided cake with too much frosting, and my husband Jack had surprised me with a weekend trip to Chicago that we still had not taken. Life was good, predictable, safe. I worked as a dental hygienist at a family practice downtown, drove a Subaru Outback with Cheerios permanently embedded in the back seats, and had not thought about Ridgemont High School or the people I knew there in what felt like a lifetime. I was reaching for a bag of frozen peas when I heard a voice behind me, that made every muscle in my body tense up before my brain could even process why. Maggie Dalton. Or I guess it's Maggie Thornton now, right? The voice was deeper than I remembered, rougher around the edges, but I knew exactly who it belonged to before I turned around. Shelby Crane stood there in the frozen aisle, her dirty blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing a faded denim jacket that looked like it had seen better days about a decade ago. She had aged in that hard way that tells you life had not been gentle. Deep lines around her mouth, a scar on her chin that was not there before, eyes that seemed simultaneously tired and too alert. We had been inseparable once, back in 9th and 10th grade, the kind of friendship that burns hot and fast during those years when everything feels like life or death. Then something happened between us, something we never spoke about again, and I had spent the last 18 years making sure our paths never crossed. Yet here she was, smiling at me with a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes, blocking my path to the checkout lanes. "Shelby," I managed to say, and I hated how my voice came out thin and uncertain. "Wow, it's been a long time." She stepped closer and I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke mixed with something floral, maybe jasmine, a combination that instantly transported me back to her childhood bedroom, where we used to stay up all night talking about boys and planning futures that never materialized. She was studying my face like she was looking for something specific, cataloging every detail, and it made me want to take a step backward into the freezer case behind me. I clutched the bag of frozen peas against my chest like some kind of pathetic shield. My mind was racing through calculations. How did she find me? Was this a coincidence? Did she know I lived here now? Had she been looking for me? Cedar Rapids was not exactly a small town, but it was not Chicago either. Running into someone from my past, someone from that specific chapter of my past, felt too precise to be random chance. 18 years, Shelby said, nodding slowly like she'd been counting every single one of them. "You look good, Maggie, real good. Got the whole suburban mom thing going on, huh? Saw the ring, the sensible car in the parking lot. You did exactly what you always said you would do. Got out, made something normal." There was an edge to the way she said normal that I did not like, a slight curl of her lip that suggested judgment or maybe jealousy. I could not tell which. She reached out and touched my arm, her fingers cold even through my sweater, and I noticed her nails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles ragged and raw. "Listen, I did not track you down to make small talk about the glory days or whatever. I need to talk to you about something important, something we both need to discuss before it's too late." The fluorescent lights above us flickered once, and in that brief stutter of light and shadow, Shelby's face looked almost skeletal, desperate in a way that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I suggested we go somewhere to talk, mostly because I did not want to have whatever conversation this was going to be in the middle of a grocery store where any of my neighbors or co-workers might walk by. We ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks away, one of those places with exposed brick and mismatched furniture that tried too hard to feel authentic. I ordered a latte I did not want just to have something to do with my hands, and Shelby got black coffee that she proceeded to not drink, just wrapped her fingers around the cup, like she was trying to absorb its warmth. For a few minutes we sat in silence, and I watched her eyes dart around the room, checking the exits, studying the other customers, never settling on any one thing for more than a second or two. She looked like a person waiting for something bad to happen, like someone who had grown accustomed to bad things happening, and now expected them as a matter of course. I remembered her as fearless once, the girl who would climb the water tower on a dare, who talked back to teachers and snuck out of her house almost every weekend. This version of Shelby was something else entirely. "Do you remember Kaylee Barton?" Shelby finally asked, and the name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Of course I remembered Kaylee Barton. I had spent 18 years trying to forget Kaylee Barton, trying to convince myself that what happened was not as bad as my memory insisted it was, that we were just kids doing stupid kid things, and nobody was really responsible. Kaylee had been a sophomore when we were freshmen, a quiet girl with thick glasses and a stutter that got worse when she was nervous. She wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation, and always ate lunch alone in the library. She was exactly the kind of target that cruel teenagers zero in on, and Shelby and I had been cruel teenagers, desperate to climb whatever invisible social ladder existed at Ridgemont High. I did not answer Shelby's question, but my face must have told her everything she needed to know, because she nodded slowly and leaned forward across the table, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "They found her, Maggie. Last month, some hikers up near Blackhawk County found remains in a ravine about 2 miles from where we left her that night. Took the medical examiner a few weeks to identify the body, but they did. Dental records." Shelby's voice was flat, clinical, like she was reciting facts from a news report rather than describing something we had been part of. My mind was spinning, trying to reconcile what she was saying with the story I had told myself for almost 2 decades. We had left Kaylee at the abandoned Mercer farmhouse that night. Sure, it was supposed to be a prank, a stupid hazing ritual that some of the older kids had dared us to pull off. We told Kaylee there was a party out there, drove her 20 miles outside of town, and then we left her. Just left her in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone and no way to get home. I remembered her face in the rearview mirror as we drove away, illuminated by our taillights, her mouth open in a scream I could not hear through the closed windows. But she was supposed to have walked home. She was supposed to have been fine. That is what I told myself every time the memory surfaced uninvited. "That's not possible," I heard myself say. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. She made it home. Her parents reported her missing like 3 days later, remember? She ran away. Everyone said she ran away. Shelby let out a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. She pulled out her phone and slid it across the table to me, and I found myself looking at a news article from a local Iowa paper dated 3 weeks ago. The headline read, "Remains found in Blackhawk County identified as missing teen from 2006. There was a school photo of Kaylee, the same awkward smile and thick glasses I remembered, frozen forever at 15 years old. The article mentioned the ongoing investigation, the cold case unit that had been assigned, the renewed calls for anyone with information to come forward. I read the words, but they seemed to float above the screen, refusing to settle into anything that made sense. Kaylee Barton had not run away. Kaylee Barton had died out there in the dark, alone and terrified, and we were the ones who put her there. "The cops have been asking around," Shelby continued, watching my face carefully as I processed the news article. "They talked to me last week, showed up at my apartment in Des Moines. 2 detectives with badges and that look they get when they think they already know the answers. Asked me about that night, about who Kaylee hung out with, if I remembered anything unusual from back then. Someone talked, Maggie. Someone from school remembered seeing us with her that day, remembered that we were the ones who invited her to the party that never existed." She paused and took a sip of her cold coffee, grimacing at the taste. "I did not tell them anything, played dumb, said I barely remembered Kaylee, that high school was a blur. But they are going to come for you too. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots, start pulling at threads." Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "We need to get our stories straight. We need to figure out what we are going to say, make sure there are no contradictions. If we stick together on this, if our versions match up perfectly, they cannot prove anything. It will just be rumors and speculation, nothing that would hold up in court." I pushed my chair back from the table, suddenly feeling like the walls of the coffee shop were closing in around me. The other customers seemed too close now, their conversations too loud, and I could not shake the paranoid thought that someone might be listening to us, recording every word. "Shelby, what exactly are you asking me to do?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, edged with something between fear and anger. "You want me to lie to the police? To cover up what we did?" She reached across the table and grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, her bitten-down nails digging into my skin. "I am asking you to protect yourself, Maggie. To protect that nice little life you built, your husband, your daughter. Think about what happens if the truth comes out. Think about what happens to Molly if her mother goes to prison for manslaughter, Or worse. We were 15 years old. We did not mean for anyone to get hurt. But you think that matters now? You think anyone is going to care about our intentions when there is a dead girl and two women who kept their mouths shut for almost 20 years? Her words burrowed into me like splinters, sharp and impossible to ignore, because she was right. She was absolutely right about what I stood to lose. We talked for another hour, going over details I had spent years trying to erase from my memory. The drive out to the Mercer farmhouse in Shelby's mom's old station wagon. The way Kaylee had been so excited, so pathetically grateful that the cool girls were finally paying attention to her. How we had laughed as we sped away, high on adrenaline and cruelty. Not thinking for a second about what might happen to a scared 15-year-old girl stranded in the middle of rural Iowa at 11 o'clock at night. Shelby had a story prepared, a neat little narrative that positioned us as bystanders rather than participants. According to her version, we had dropped Kaylee off at the farmhouse where other kids were supposed to be waiting, and we had no idea she never made it inside. No idea there was no party at all. It was thin, full of holes that any competent detective would spot immediately, but Shelby delivered it with such conviction that I almost believed it myself. By the time we left the coffee shop, the sun was setting and I had agreed to nothing, but I had not refused either. I told her I needed time to think, and she gave me a burner phone with her number programmed in, told me to contact her that way and not through any traceable means. The weight of that cheap plastic phone in my pocket felt like carrying a live grenade all the way home. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed next to Jack, listening to his steady breathing, staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed every moment of that day 18 years ago. But something else was bothering me too. Something about Shelby's story that did not quite add up. She said the police had talked to her last week, that someone from school had remembered seeing us with Kaylee. But how would anyone have remembered that specific detail after so many years? Kaylee was a loner. Nobody paid attention to her. That was the whole point. That was why we chose her. And then there was the way Shelby had found me, had known exactly where I lived, where I shopped, what car I drove. She had done research, serious research, the kind that takes time and effort. I got out of bed around 2 in the morning and went down to the kitchen, opened my laptop, and started searching. What I found made my blood turn to ice water. Shelby Crane had been arrested twice in the past 5 years, once for check fraud, once for identity theft. She had done 8 months in a county jail in Nebraska and was currently on probation. And 3 months ago, right around the time Kaylee's remains were discovered, Shelby had been named as a person of interest in an unrelated case involving the disappearance of a woman in Des Moines. The pieces started clicking together in my head with horrible clarity. Shelby was not here to protect me. She was here to use me. If we both told the same fabricated story and it fell apart, which it inevitably would, she could claim that I was the one who came up with the lie, that I had manipulated her into covering for me. She could paint herself as the reluctant accomplice, the friend who went along with my scheme out of misguided loyalty. And if the investigation into Kaylee's death went badly for her, if they started looking at her record and connecting dots, she would need someone else to take the fall. Someone with a clean record, a stable life, someone who had everything to lose and would therefore be a credible villain in whatever narrative she was constructing. I thought about that burner phone sitting in my coat pocket, probably purchased with cash, untraceable to her but absolutely traceable to me if anyone found it. I thought about how she had grabbed my wrist in the coffee shop, hard enough to leave faint bruises that were only now starting to show. Evidence. She was building evidence. The realization hit me with such force that I actually gasped out loud in my dark kitchen, and I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep myself from falling. Every word she had said to me that afternoon was a carefully placed trap, and I had walked right into it like the naive suburban mom she clearly thought I was. I did not sleep the rest of that night. When the sun came up, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had. I called in sick to work, drove Molly to school like everything was normal, and then I went to the Cedar Rapids police station. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, rehearsing what I was going to say, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Then I walked inside and asked to speak with someone about the Kaylee Barton case. The detective who eventually sat across from me was a woman about my age named Reyes, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that somehow made everything easier. I told her everything. About the prank, about leaving Kaylee at the farmhouse, about 18 years of silence and guilt and self-deception. I told her about Shelby showing up at the grocery store, about the story she wanted me to tell, about the burner phone and the bruises on my wrist. I gave her everything I had, held nothing back, and when I was done, I felt like I had been turned inside out, like every secret I had ever kept was now scattered across the table between us. Detective Reyes listened without interrupting, took notes, and when I finished, she simply nodded and said they would be in touch. The next few months were the hardest of my life, but not in the way I had expected. It turned out that Shelby had been playing an even more dangerous game than I realized. When the police brought her in for questioning and confronted her with my statement, her carefully constructed story collapsed almost immediately. She tried to claim that I had been the mastermind behind the prank, that I had driven the car that night while she begged me to turn around, but there were problems with her version. Big problems. The police had already found text messages on her old phone, recovered through some kind of digital forensics I did not fully understand, that showed she had been bragging about the prank to another friend the day after it happened. Messages where she described herself as the one behind the wheel, laughing about how scared Kaylee had looked. But that was not the worst of it. During the investigation, detectives discovered that Shelby had been in contact with Kaylee's younger brother, a man named Harris, who had spent his entire adult life searching for answers about his sister. She had approached him 6 months earlier, claiming to have information, stringing him along while she figured out how to profit from the situation. She had tried to extort money from him in exchange for details about what happened that night, and when he refused to pay and threatened to go to the police, she panicked. That was when she came looking for me, not to coordinate stories, but to set up a fall guy in case everything went sideways. The prosecutor offered me a deal in exchange for my full cooperation and testimony against Shelby. I pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment, a charge that carried no prison time given my clean record, my cooperation, and the fact that I had been 15 years old when the incident occurred. I received 5 years of probation and 200 hours of community service, which I completed by volunteering at a crisis hotline for at-risk teens. Shelby was not so fortunate. Between the Kaylee Barton case, the attempted extortion of Harris Barton, and the other charges that surfaced during the investigation, she was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row, watching the woman who had once been my best friend try to lie her way out of consequences that had been decades in the making. She never looked at me, not once, but I could not look away from her. I needed to see it through to the end. Jack and I are still together, though it took months of therapy and difficult conversations to rebuild the trust I had shattered by keeping this secret for so long. Molly knows a version of the truth now, age-appropriate but honest, and she still looks at me the same way she always did, which is more than I deserve. I think about Kaylee Barton every single day. I think about her stumbling through the dark, trying to find her way home, scared and alone because 2 girls thought her suffering would be entertaining. I cannot change what I did, cannot undo the cruelty of my 15-year-old self. But I can carry her memory forward, and I can make sure that the rest of my life means something, even if it will never be enough to balance the scales. Some debts cannot be repaid. You just learn to live with the weight of them. The reunion invitation showed up in my inbox during a stretch of my life that felt oddly suspended. Like nothing bad was happening, but nothing meaningful was either. I was in my mid-30s, working a stable job, living alone, and mostly keeping to myself after a quiet breakup earlier that year. High school felt distant, almost fictional, but curiosity pulled me in anyway. It promised familiar faces, nostalgia, and the comfort of being someone I used to be for one night. I drove to the hotel ballroom just before sunset, telling myself I'd stay an hour and leave. The parking lot was already half full, laughter spilling out whenever the doors opened. Inside, the air smelled like cheap wine and old cologne, and every conversation sounded slightly too loud. I remember thinking it felt less like a celebration and more like a checkpoint in time. Near the bar, someone said my name in a way that made it sound rehearsed, careful. Lydia stood there, smiling wide, looking almost exactly like she had back then, just sharpened by adulthood. She'd been one of those people everyone knew, the kind who floated between groups without effort. We hugged, and she commented on how easy it was to spot me across the room, which struck me as strange given how crowded it was. We started talking, and almost immediately her questions came fast and specific. Where did I work now? Did I live alone? How long had I been in the same place? She remembered details I didn't recall ever sharing, like the street I grew up on and my old locker number. Each answer I gave seemed to make her more attentive, not less. As the night went on, Lydia rarely left my side, even when others tried to pull her away. She asked about past relationships, what kind of schedule I kept, whether I still talked to anyone from our graduating class. It didn't feel like catching up. It felt like inventory. When I laughed it off or gave vague answers, she gently circled back later, rephrasing the same questions. Her eyes didn't wander when people spoke to us, and she never checked her phone. At one point, she casually mentioned she'd moved around a lot, hopping states, keeping things flexible. The way she said it carried a weight that lingered longer than the words themselves. I felt an urge to excuse myself, but politeness kept me rooted there. I stepped outside for air when the music got louder and the room thinned out, scrolling through my phone to ground myself. A local news alert popped up, one of those algorithm-fed stories tied loosely to my location. The photo stopped me cold, not because it was graphic, but because I recognized the face immediately. Lydia's name appeared beneath it, linked to an arrest warrant issued out of state for multiple violent offenses. The article mentioned she was believed to be traveling, possibly attending events connected to her past. My pulse thudded in my ears as the realization settled into place. She hadn't been reminiscing earlier that night, she'd been confirming details. I wasn't just someone she remembered, I was someone she'd been looking for. When I went back inside, the room felt rearranged, like furniture shifted while I was gone. Fewer people lingered, coats in hand, voices softer and more cautious. Lydia spotted me immediately from across the room, her attention locking in before I even reached our table. She asked if everything was all right, tilting her head in a way that suggested concern but carried no warmth. I lied without thinking, said I just needed some air. She nodded, then mentioned how late it was getting and how people always rushed off without saying goodbye. Her gaze flicked toward the exits as she spoke, as if tracking who had already left. That's when I noticed she was subtly repositioning herself between me and the main doors. I tried to keep the conversation light, while my thoughts raced ahead of my words. Every question she asked now sounded different, sharper, like it had teeth. She brought up how unsafe the world had become, how people vanished from each other's lives so easily. When she asked whether I still parked on the street or used a garage, I felt my chest tighten. I deflected, joked about how boring my routine was, but she didn't laugh. Instead, she told me she always admired how predictable I'd been in school, how reliable. It wasn't a compliment the way she delivered it. It sounded more like a classification. Around us, staff began stacking chairs, signaling the night was ending. As people filtered out, Lydia suggested we walk together to the parking lot, said it would be nice to keep talking without the noise. I declined, claiming I had a call to make, and she studied my face as if checking for cracks. Her smile returned, slower this time, and she said she'd wait. That was when I noticed a man near the coat rack watching us, someone I hadn't seen earlier. He didn't wear a name tag and never interacted with anyone else. Lydia caught me looking and casually mentioned he was an old friend too, though they never acknowledged each other directly. The implication hung heavy between us, unspoken but loud. I told Lydia I needed to use the restroom and walked straight past it toward the service hallway instead. My heart pounded, not from panic but from a sharp clarity I hadn't felt all night. I slipped out a side exit meant for staff, the cold air biting hard against my face. I didn't head for my car right away. I circled the building, staying in the shadows, listening. From across the lot, I saw Lydia step outside with the man, scanning the rows of vehicles slowly, methodically. They weren't searching randomly. They were narrowing things down. That's when I understood the reunion hadn't been a coincidence at all. I waited longer than felt reasonable before moving, counting breaths and watching their silhouettes drift apart. When Lydia walked back inside alone, I took that as my opening. I stayed low and crossed the lot between cars, choosing a route that kept me hidden from the entrance lights. I didn't unlock my car right away. The sound felt too loud in the quiet. Instead, I pulled my phone out and dialed a non-emergency line, keeping my voice steady while explaining what I'd seen and what I'd just learned. The dispatcher asked for descriptions, not names, and told me to stay where I was. I watched the doors the entire time, every shadow making my shoulders tense. 2 cruisers arrived without sirens, easing into the lot like they belonged there. I flagged one down and gave them the article, the questions, the man by the coat rack. One officer nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the building. They went inside while I stayed put, hands wrapped around my keys so tight the metal left marks. Minutes passed, then more, stretching thin. When the officers came back out, Lydia wasn't with them. They said she'd left through a different exit earlier just before closing. The man was gone too. There was no chase, no dramatic arrest, just a quiet confirmation that my instincts had been right. I drove home a different way, looping through streets I didn't normally take, checking mirrors more often than necessary. Once inside, I locked everything and sat on the floor with my back against the door until my breathing slowed. I replayed every moment of the night, every question she asked, every detail I'd handed over without thinking. The officers followed up later telling me the warrant was active and that my report helped establish her pattern. They advised changing routines, updating security, and keeping my circle informed. It felt strange hearing my life reduced to precautions, but I followed everyone. Nothing else happened after that night, at least nothing visible. No calls, no sightings, no sudden knocks. Still, I don't attend reunions anymore, and I'm careful about what parts of my past I reopen. The idea that someone could step back into your life wearing familiarity like a disguise hasn't left me. Lydia didn't recognize me because she missed me. She recognized me because she needed to. That distinction changed how I see memories and how I protect them. I share this here because I learned the hard way that sometimes being remembered isn't about connection at all. Grief has a way of shrinking your world without asking permission, and that's where my head was at during the early weeks after we lost Ben. Life had been pretty ordinary before that. Nothing dramatic, just work, errands, and the usual routines that keep days stitched together. After the funeral, those routines fell apart fast. I wasn't sleeping much, barely eating, and the apartment felt louder when it was quiet. Most of my friends checked in with quick messages, which I appreciated, but everything still felt distant, like I was watching my own life through fogged glass. That's when Caleb reached out. We hadn't spoken in years, not since drifting apart after college, but we shared a lot of history, especially with Ben. Seeing his name pop up felt strange, but also oddly comforting in that moment. Caleb started with long messages about memories, inside jokes only we would remember, details that made the loss feel real instead of abstract. He said he understood how disorienting it was, that grief didn't follow rules, and those words landed harder than I expected. Soon the messages turned into calls, sometimes late at night when the apartment felt unbearable. He listened more than he talked, letting me ramble, letting silence stretch without rushing to fill it. When I mentioned I hadn't gone grocery shopping since the funeral, he offered to drop some things off. It felt harmless, even thoughtful. A bag of food appeared at my door the next day, along with a note telling me to take care of myself. At that point, It felt like kindness, nothing more. After that, Caleb started finding small ways to be present. He offered to drive me to work when my car wouldn't start, said it gave him something to do. He reminded me about bills I might forget, sent calendar invites for things I hadn't had the energy to track. Each gesture came wrapped in concern, framed as support during a fragile time. I noticed he spoke a lot about how people disappear after funerals, how grief shows you who really stays. Hearing that while feeling isolated made his presence feel essential. He began stopping by unannounced, always apologetic, always saying he just wanted to make sure I was okay. I didn't question it then. I was too tired to set boundaries, too relieved not to be alone. The shift was subtle enough that I can't point to a single moment where alarms went off. It started with comments about my other friends, how they hadn't checked in as much, how he worried they didn't understand what I was going through. Then it turned into suggestions about decisions I should or shouldn't make while not in a good headspace. If I hesitated, he reminded me how vulnerable I was, how people could take advantage of that. The irony didn't hit me right away. He kept track of my schedule better than I did, corrected me when I remembered conversations differently, insisted he was just looking out for me. Somewhere in all that care, my days stopped feeling like mine. I began realizing that grief wasn't the only thing tightening around my life. The more Caleb stayed involved, the more my own instincts started to dull. Decisions that used to feel automatic suddenly came with a need for approval, or at least his input. If I mentioned plans, he'd ask detailed questions, then gently steer me toward what he thought was safer or smarter. He framed it as protecting me from burnout or bad choices, always tying it back to how fragile grief could make a person. When I pushed back, even lightly, he looked genuinely hurt, reminding me how much he'd stepped up when others hadn't. That guilt worked better than any argument. I began choosing silence over disagreement, telling myself it was temporary, just until things stabilized. Small boundaries I tried to rebuild didn't last long. One evening, after I said I needed a night alone, he showed up anyway, saying he'd had a bad feeling and didn't want me spiraling by myself. Another time, he went through my mail while waiting for me to get home, claiming he was worried about unpaid bills. Each time there was an explanation that sounded reasonable on the surface, wrapped in concern and familiarity. Yet I started noticing how tense my body felt whenever his car pulled up. Relief mixed with dread in a way I couldn't explain. The apartment no longer felt like a refuge, but like a shared space I hadn't agreed to share. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. It crept in during an ordinary moment, while he was talking about how dependent I'd become on his help. He said it casually, almost fondly, like it was proof he mattered. Something about that phrasing stuck with me. I replayed conversations in my head, noticed patterns I'd ignored, remembered how often my own doubts had been brushed aside. His support always came with direction. His comfort always had conditions. Grief had lowered my defenses, and he'd stepped neatly into the opening. Understanding that didn't erase the sadness, but it sharpened it, giving it edges instead of fog. Taking space felt risky, like removing a brace before a bone had healed. Still, I started small. I delayed replies, stopped sharing every detail of my day, quietly handled problems he usually jumped in to solve. The pushback came fast. He accused me of shutting him out, questioned whether I was coping as well as I thought. This time, instead of apologizing, I paid attention to how that made me feel. Not supported, not understood, but managed. That clarity hurt, but it also grounded me. For the first time since Ben's death, something felt solid again, even if it was just my resolve to take my life back. Distance changed the tone immediately. Messages from Caleb shifted from concern to irritation, then back to concern again, as if flipping a switch might pull me closer. He started referencing things I'd told him in confidence, using them as examples of why I still needed guidance. That's when I noticed how often he spoke in absolutes, how rarely he asked what I wanted. One afternoon he suggested taking over my finances for a while, saying paperwork was dangerous territory for someone grieving. Hearing that out loud finally cut through whatever haze I was in. Care doesn't ask for control as a prerequisite. I told him no, clearly without softening it, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. What came next was pressure dressed up as worry. He warned me I was isolating myself, that people in mourning often make reckless choices. When I didn't respond the way he expected, he showed up at my door again, insisting we needed to talk. I didn't open it. Instead, I spoke through the door, voice steady in a way that surprised me, and told him I needed space and that he had to respect it. He lingered outside longer than necessary, then left without another word. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks without waking up in a panic. The quiet felt earned. The following days were uncomfortable, but honest. I reached out to friends I'd drifted from, admitted I'd let one person take up too much space. No one judged me. They listened, brought meals, sat with me without agendas. I changed my routine, locked things down, and stopped sharing personal details with anyone who hadn't earned that trust. Caleb tried a few more times, alternating apologies with reminders of everything he'd done. I didn't engage. Eventually, the messages stopped. Losing that connection hurt in a different way than grief, but it was cleaner, less suffocating. Looking back, I don't think Caleb saw himself as a villain. I think he saw opportunity in my vulnerability and convinced himself it was love or loyalty. That's what makes it unsettling. Grief doesn't just attract comfort, it can attract control. The day everything shifted wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, built on a decision to listen to my own unease and act on it. Ben's death cracked my life open, but it also taught me something hard and necessary. Support should help you stand on your own, not teach you how to lean forever. For most of last spring, life felt loud in a way I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding dramatic. I had just ended a long relationship, quit a job that drained me, and needed space where nobody expected updates or explanations. That's how I ended up renting a small farmhouse in a rural pocket of the state, surrounded by fields and gravel roads that barely showed up on maps. I told almost no one where I was going, not out of fear, but because I wanted the quiet to stay intact. The plan was simple: unpack slowly, reset my sleep schedule, and let my nervous system calm down. My days were meant to be repetitive in a comforting way, like morning coffee by the window and short walks down the dirt road. The house smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away that nights felt completely still. It felt like the kind of place where nothing followed you. A few days in, I drove into the nearest town for groceries, the kind of place with one main street and a single store that sold everything from canned soup to fishing bait. The bell above the door rang when I walked in, sharp against the quiet. I was comparing prices in the cereal aisle when I heard someone say my name, not loudly, but with a certainty that made me turn around. Standing there was Rachel, someone I hadn't seen in years. Wearing a denim jacket and that familiar crooked posture I recognized immediately. For a second, my brain treated it like a joke, like the town was playing tricks on me. We stared at each other longer than normal before laughing, both of us saying variations of, "What are you doing here?" She said she was just passing through and shrugged it off, like the explanation didn't matter. I left the store smiling, telling myself coincidences happen, even strange ones. After that, she kept appearing, always in places I had just started considering mine. She was at the coffee counter the next morning, already holding the blend I'd asked about the day before. Later that afternoon, I saw her car parked near the trailhead I'd discovered on my second walk, the one I hadn't mentioned to anyone. Each time she acted casual, waving first, acting like we were just two people reconnecting by chance. She commented on how peaceful the area was, how perfect it suited me, using words I'd said to no one out loud. At one point, she joked about how brave it was to disappear without telling people where you landed. I laughed with her, but the laughter felt thin, like it belonged to someone else. By evening, my routine no longer felt private, just observed. The moment everything shifted came back at the farmhouse, while I was unlocking the door at dusk. Rachel's voice came from behind me, already using the driveway like it was familiar territory. She mentioned the rental by name, corrected herself when she got the square footage wrong, then laughed it off. Then she said the date I'd arrived, exact, not guessed, as if it had been marked somewhere important. She talked about how hard it can be to really vanish, even when you think you've covered your tracks. Standing there, keys still in my hand, it clicked that this wasn't a lucky accident layered on top of another. Running into me required knowing where I'd go, when I'd arrive, and how long I planned to stay. The quiet I'd come here for hadn't been broken by chance at all. The next morning I tried to convince myself I was spiraling. Small towns recycle faces, and maybe she really did have a reason to be around. Still, I changed my routine on purpose, like a little experiment. Instead of driving into town for coffee, I made it at home and went out early to a different store 20 minutes farther, one I'd noticed on the way in but hadn't used yet. I didn't take my usual route either. I turned off onto a back road that cut through a patch of pine and dumped me near a feed supply place. I bought random things I didn't need just to justify the trip, then sat in my car for a minute with the engine off, listening. When I finally walked into the store, the air smelled like fertilizer and warm rubber. I picked up a basket, turned down the first aisle, and saw Rachel at the end cap, already looking up like she'd been waiting for me to enter the frame. She didn't act surprised. That was the detail that stuck like a burr in my head. If it was coincidence, there would have been that startled little flinch people do, the "oh wow, you too" expression. Instead, she smiled like the day had gone according to plan. She fell into step beside me and started talking about practical things, how the road to my farmhouse gets slick after rain, how the landlord tends to forget to salt the steps, how the porch light sometimes flickers if you leave it on too long. I stopped walking and asked her, as calmly as I could, how she knew all that. She laughed and said something like, "You know me, I notice stuff." But her eyes didn't match the joke. She was watching my face the way someone watches a lock they're trying to pick, patient, focused, confident they'll get it open. On the drive back, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. A dark sedan sat in a turnout near the highway entrance, idling. It wasn't unusual by itself, but I saw it again later, parked at the edge of town, and then once more farther down the rural road that led toward my rental. Each time it was angled slightly differently, like whoever was inside understood sightlines. When I got home, I walked the perimeter of the farmhouse and found a thin strip of plastic tucked under the porch railing, like someone had torn it off a package and left it there. Near the side door, in the dirt where the grass thinned out, there were fresh shoe prints that weren't mine. Wide tread, heavy heel, deeper than you'd expect from someone just strolling past. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to make my brain accept a simple truth. I wasn't alone in my reset. That night, Rachel texted me from a number I hadn't saved. The message was short, friendly on the surface, but it read like a hand on the back of my neck. "You still doing that little evening walk around 7?" I hadn't told her that. I hadn't posted it. I hadn't even said it out loud on a call. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, then brightened it again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less personal. I didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message popped up. "Don't make this weird. I'm just happy I found you." That's when I realized the scariest part wasn't that she knew where I was. It was that she thought she had the right to know, like my attempt to disappear was something she could override with enough effort. Sleep didn't really happen after that. I stayed on the couch with the lights off, listening to the old house settle and pop, every sound suddenly meaningful. Around early morning, headlights swept across the front windows, slow and deliberate, then disappeared. I didn't move until birds started making noise outside, the normal daytime sounds returning like nothing had happened. When I checked my phone again, there was one more message from Rachel, sent while it was still dark. She wrote that she'd always been good at finding people who didn't want to be found. Said it like a skill she was proud of. There was no threat spelled out, but it didn't need one. The message carried the weight of effort, of time spent planning, of someone who had decided my quiet belonged to her too. I packed that morning without trying to be subtle. Clothes went into bags, drawers left half open, dishes stacked and forgotten. I called the landlord and told him I was leaving earlier than planned, blamed it on a family issue I didn't explain. My hands were steady, my voice surprisingly calm, like my body had already accepted the decision. Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time and noticed small things that hadn't been there when I arrived. A moved chair on the porch, a scuff on the doorframe, a faint smell of cigarette smoke that didn't belong to me. It felt like proof, even if I couldn't show it to anyone else. When I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back, afraid I'd see someone standing where the field met the trees. I didn't drive straight home. I took highways, changed directions twice, stopped in a crowded place just to sit and breathe around other people. Rachel texted again while I was there, asking if I'd gone somewhere, adding a sad face emoji like we were joking. I blocked the number, then blocked it again when it came through from a different one. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about coincidence or nostalgia. Reappearing in my life took coordination, access to information, patience. It meant my attempt to reset hadn't failed because I did something wrong. It failed because someone else had decided not to let me disappear. Eventually, I settled somewhere else, closer to people, louder than I wanted, but safer. Months passed without seeing her, though I still catch myself scanning stores, parking lots, reflections in glass. I don't post my location online anymore. I don't tell new people where I live until I trust them. Some days I replay that first moment in the grocery store and wonder how long she'd known I was going there, how early the plan started. I never confronted her, never got answers, and maybe that's the point. The most unsettling part isn't what she did. It's realizing how carefully it was done and how easily someone can reach into your life when they decide your privacy doesn't count.